The carriage was shaking so violently that his teeth were chattering. Daniel opened his eyes and didn't know where he was. His hands felt unfamiliar. His fingers were longer than he remembered. A coarse traveling cloak hung over his shoulder, embroidered with a coat of arms he'd never seen before. A splitting pain pulsed through his head, and with it, memories flooded back. Someone else's memories. The youngest son of the Hartwell family. A feast at the king's nephew's house. One careless word. A decree of exile. He remembered all of this as if he had lived that life himself. Yet at the same time, he remembered something else. Wet asphalt. A knife under his ribs. A woman in an alley whom he had tried to protect. Darkness. He was dead. He was definitely dead. And now he sat in a wooden carriage on a rutted road, in the body of a man he had never been. In his right hand, he clutched a scroll bearing a heavy wax seal. Daniel unrolled it, a decree from the royal chancery transferring the province of Hollowmarch to the administration of Baron Daniel Hartwell. At the bottom was a note in small handwriting. According to the latest census, the population is 412 souls, of whom 87 are liable for taxes. 87 taxpayers for an entire province. Daniel read that number twice. In his previous life at Chicago City Hall, that many people wouldn't have filled a single floor of the municipal building. The carriage came to a stop. The coachman turned toward him. This was the only person the crown had assigned to the exiled baron. A gaunt man with a weather-beaten face and indifferent eyes. He silently jabbed his whip forward. Daniel grabbed the side of the carriage and climbed out. Cold spring rain lashed his face. A plain stretched out before him, gray with last year's grass. A shallow river wound its way through the lowlands as a dull streak. On a hill stood a ruined keep, roofless, with its eastern wall collapsed. 3 thin wisps of smoke rose in the distance above the roofs of villages invisible from here. That was all. His entire province, his entire inheritance. Daniel stood in the rain, looking at this desolation, and realized that in his former world, such a place would have been labeled a depressed territory, and a report would have been written declaring the investment unfeasible. Then he turned his head and saw the road. There were people on the road, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. They stretched out in a long column from the horizon, women carrying children in their arms, old people sitting right in the mud because they didn't have the strength to stand, men with empty eyes dragging bundles on their backs from which their last possessions were sticking out. The children were silent. That was the scariest part of all. Children in such columns are always silent because they no longer have the strength to cry. Daniel had seen this before, not here, in another life, on a computer screen at City Hall while preparing reports on resettlement programs. Only then was there a screen between him and these people, but now there were 30 paces of wet road between them. His economist's brain kicked in automatically. 4,000 people, maybe more. The average level of exhaustion is roughly 2 weeks without proper food. The mortality rate in such camps without intervention is about 20% in the first month. That meant 800 corpses in 30 days. 800 people who would die right here on this road if nothing was done. The coachman spat into the mud. He said he'd dropped off his lordship and asked what message to convey in the capital. Daniel didn't answer. He stood there, staring at the crowd. Rain ran down his face. The young baron's borrowed memories suggested that a proper nobleman in such a situation would have closed the gates. Only there were no gates, and the nobleman inside this body was gone too. There was Dan from Chicago, a 32-year-old urban economist who had spent his entire career proving one simple thing to city officials. It's cheaper to give a person a job than to keep them on the street. It's cheaper to give a refugee a roof over their head than to deport them. Every living, well-fed person is not an expense, it's an asset. And now this economist stood in a foreign body in a foreign world, in the cold rain, before 4,000 hungry people, holding a scroll with a seal in his hands and with 87 subjects behind him. And then it happened. Something warm stirred in his chest. Not pain, not heat. A quiet, steady pulsation, as if someone had placed a small sun beneath his ribs, and a voice sounded in his head, calm and businesslike, like an accountant reading the final balance sheet. The voice announced that Daniel had been recognized as the ruler of the territory of Hollow March, that the ruler's treasury had been activated, that the daily allocation amounted to 1 gold coin for every citizen who recognized him as their lord, provided they were safe, well-fed, and residing there voluntarily. The current balance stood at 87 coins per day. Daniel blinked. He mentally reread it once more. 1 coin per person. Only for those who are well-fed. Only for those who are safe. Only for those who stay voluntarily. A hungry person brings in half. A sick person, a quarter. A dead person, -10. The economist inside Daniel froze for a second, then began to calculate. 4,000 refugees. If they're fed and given shelter, that's 4,000 coins a day. If they stay voluntarily, if they accept him, 4,000 coins every day. For people whom all the other barons chase away from their gates like trash, Daniel slowly turned to the coachman. He said he wanted to have one thing conveyed to the capital. Baron Hartwell thanks the crown for its generous gift. The coachman looked at him as if he were crazy. Then he shrugged, climbed onto the box, and turned the horses around. The carriage drove off. Daniel was left alone on the road. 20 paces separated him from the crowd of refugees. He walked toward them. The rain grew heavier. The people in the front rows looked up. They saw a young man in a cloak, bearing a nobleman's coat of arms, walking straight toward them. Not on horseback, not surrounded by guards, on foot, through the mud, alone. Daniel stopped in front of them, raised the wet scroll above his head, and shouted as loud as he could. He shouted that he had no gates, but there would be a roof, and whoever wanted to eat should follow him. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then an old man in the front row struggled to his feet from the mud, grabbed his bundle, and took a step. Behind him stood a woman with a child. Behind her, 2 men. The crowd slowly began to move. Daniel turned and headed toward the ruined keep on the hill. Behind him, 4,000 people who had nowhere else to go stretched out along the muddy road. The first night was a nightmare. The keep turned out to be even worse than it looked from a distance. The roof had collapsed in 3 places. The staircase to the second floor had rotted away. The basement was ankle-deep in water. The only thing that worked was the hearth in the main hall. Daniel ordered a fire to be lit. Ordered isn't quite accurate, because there was no one to give orders to. Of the 87 subjects, only 12 had made it to the keep. The rest lived in the villages, and didn't yet knew they had a new baron. 12 old men and women stood by the wall and looked at Daniel with the expression of people who had already seen 4 barons, none of whom had lasted more than a year. Daniel asked them to tell him their names. They did. He memorized every one. Then he asked where he could find the village headman of the nearest village. They told him that the headman lived a 2-hour walk to the south, and his name was Gareth, and that Gareth wouldn't come because his legs hurt, and he didn't believe in the new barons. Daniel stepped out into the rain and headed south, a 2-hour walk through the mud. He found Gareth's village, 23 houses, 11 of which were inhabited. Gareth was sitting on the porch of his house, a gray-haired, sturdy man with heavy hands and the face of someone who had grown weary of life 30 years ago, but kept going out of habit. Daniel stopped in front of him, soaked to the waist, and said he was the new baron. Gareth looked at him and replied that he knew, and that the previous baron had also come and had also promised something. But then he left 3 months later, taking the last of the grain with him. Daniel nodded. He said he understood and that he had no grain, but there were 4,000 starving people at the keep's gates, and he needed help. Gareth asked what kind of help exactly. Daniel said he needed someone who knew this land, someone who knew where to dig wells, where to pitch a tent so it wouldn't get flooded, where at least something edible grows. Gareth was silent for a long time. Then he stood up and said he'd show him, but if this baron ran away too, Gareth would personally find him and break both his legs. They returned to the keep at dawn. Daniel hadn't slept all night. Gareth showed him 3 key locations: a hollow behind a hill where people could take shelter from the wind, an old well that had become clogged but could be cleared in a day, a grove to the west where the trees were suitable for quick felling. It wasn't much, but it was something. Daniel went down to the keep's cellar. The water had drained away overnight. An old chest stood in the corner. Daniel opened it. Inside lay coins, 87 gold coins, real ones, heavy, royal mint. He picked one up and turned it over in his fingers. It was warm. The economist inside him uttered a single word: working capital. Daniel closed the chest and went back upstairs. On the second day, he gathered those 12 old men and Gareth. He laid out the coins on the table. He explained his plan. He wouldn't buy grain from the neighboring baron because the baron charged triple the price and would sell rotten grain anyway. Instead, he would buy grain directly from the refugees themselves. Many of them have their last handfuls tucked away in their bundles, which they're holding on to. Daniel would pay above market price for each handful. All the grain would go into a communal pot, porridge for everyone. Those who sold their grain will receive money, and with that money, they'll be able to buy tools tomorrow when Daniel sends Gareth to the nearest village for shovels and axes. The money will come back to Daniel. The grain will stay with the people. And most importantly, no one will feel like a pauper. They didn't ask for it. They sold it. That's the difference. A huge difference. Gareth listened in silence. Then he took off his hat and said that he was 72 years old and had been the village elder for 30 years, and he had never heard of anything like this. Daniel replied that this was called the circulation of money within the community, and that in his homeland they taught this in school. Gareth didn't ask what kind of homeland that was. He simply nodded and went to gather the people. By the evening of the second day, the cauldrons were boiling porridge, watery, almost empty, but hot. 4,000 people were eating for the first time in several days. Daniel stood by the cauldron and handed out bowls. To everyone who approached, he said 2 words, his name and a question. "What's your name?" People answered. Some didn't respond right away because they weren't used to someone asking their name. Daniel memorized them. It was a habit from City Hall. His boss in Chicago used to say that a program that doesn't know its clients' names isn't a program, it's just going through the motions. Daniel learned 140 names that evening. By nightfall, he could barely stand. Gareth found him sitting on the steps of the keep. Daniel was counting on his fingers. There had been 87 coins that morning. There should be more tomorrow. If at least some of the refugees already consider him one of their own, if porridge and shelter count, if the ability works the way he understood it to. Gareth asked what he was muttering. Daniel said he was counting. Gareth shrugged and brought him a blanket. Daniel fell asleep right there on the steps. He dreamed of an office in Chicago City Hall and a computer screen on which, instead of spreadsheets, there were the faces of people standing in line at the soup kitchen. At dawn on the 3rd day, Daniel went down to the basement. He opened the chest. He paused. Inside were coins, not 87, 312. He counted them 3 times. 312 gold coins. That meant yesterday about 225 people out of those 4,000 had decided that this strange baron who hands out porridge and asks for names might be worth staying for. 225 people in a single day. Daniel sat down on the basement floor and covered his face with his hands. Not from exhaustion, from realizing the scale of it all. If he could feed and provide for all 4,000, that would be 4,000 coins a day. If they were not just fed, but satisfied, then more, much more. The system paid for human dignity, equality, in gold, for every person who was doing well. Daniel laughed quietly and hoarsely. In his former world, he'd spent years writing reports proving that investing in people paid off. Here, it wasn't a metaphor. Here, it was a literal coin in a chest every morning. He poured the coins onto the table in front of Gareth. The village elder turned pale. He asked where they came from. Daniel replied that it didn't matter. What mattered was where they were going, and he began to explain. Some of the coins were for food. Some were for tools. Some were to send 3 strong men to the village 20 miles away to buy nails, rope, and canvas for tents. Gareth listened and nodded. Then he said there was a problem. The people around the fire were already splitting into groups. Eastern refugees on one side, Southerners on the other. The old-timers kept to themselves. Last night, there was a fight. 2 Southerners picked a fight with an Easterner because he was praying to the wrong god. Daniel rubbed the bridge of his nose. He knew this too. The same thing had happened in Chicago at the intersection of migrant communities. There was only one solution, a common cause. People who dig a well together don't fight over gods. Daniel announced the first workday. He divided the people into groups, not by origin, but by task. Those who knew how to chop wood went to the right. Those who knew how to dig went to the left. Those who knew how to prepare food for the cauldrons. Those who knew how to sew went to the tent where clothes were mended. An eastern peasant stood next to a southern one. They shared one axe between the 2 of them. By evening, they could no longer remember which god each of them prayed to, because they were both too exhausted. 1,847 coins sounded like a lot. In reality, it wasn't enough for anything. Daniel sat down by the hearth in the main hall of the keep and began to count. 4,000 people. Everyone needed food every day. A simple porridge made from grains cost 2 coins for 10 servings. That came to 800 coins just for food. Tools were expensive. A single axe at the nearest market cost 15 coins. A shovel, 10. A saw, 20. Nails were sold by weight, and a pound of nails cost as much as a craftsman's daily wages. Canvas for tents, rope, cauldrons. Daniel covered the entire wall of the keep with charcoal marks. Gareth stood nearby, staring at the numbers with the expression of someone witnessing witchcraft. Daniel explained to him that it wasn't witchcraft, it's a budget. Gareth asked what a budget was. Daniel replied that a budget is when you write down how much you have and how much you need, and then figure out where to bang your head against the wall. Gareth didn't smile. He rarely smiled at all. On the 5th day, the first death occurred. An old man among the eastern refugees. He was too weak when he arrived, and the porridge didn't help. Daniel found out about it in the morning when he went down to see the people. The old man had already been wrapped in rags. His daughter was sitting nearby, silent. Daniel approached and asked what her father's name was. She said his name was Thomas. Daniel remembered. Then he went down to the basement. There were 10 coins fewer in the chest than he'd expected, a penalty for a lost subject. 10 coins for 1 dead person. The system didn't just encourage care, it punished for losses. Daniel stood over the chest and felt something cold tightening in his chest. not because of the loss of coins, because of the realization. Every person who died on his land would cost him 10 coins a day, not just one day, every day, until the penalty was paid off. He didn't know when the penalty would be paid off, maybe in a week, maybe in a month. The ability didn't explain the rules in advance. It taught through experience. It was harsh. 7 people died in the first week. 3 old men, 2 children, a woman who had already been sick when she arrived, a man who on the second day fell from the roof of an unfinished shack and broke his neck. Daniel buried each one. He knelt in the mud and helped dig the graves. He remembered all 7 names: Thomas, Etta, little Finn, a girl named Ro who was 4 years old. After the funerals, Gareth said that it wasn't fitting for a baron to dig graves. Daniel replied that it was his duty to know the value of every life, and that the price of 7 deaths was 70 coins a day, which he was now missing out on. Gareth shook his head and said he'd never seen a lord who counted the dead in coins and yet wept over each one. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't know how to explain that to him it was one and the same. On the 9th day, he learned another rule. A drunken blacksmith among the old-timers named Bran got into a fight with an Eastern refugee. The guard Daniel had assigned from among the burly men struck Bran on the back with the shaft of his spear. Not hard, just enough to stop him. Bran fell and howled. The next morning, there were 43 fewer coins in the chest. Daniel didn't immediately understand why. Then it dawned on him. 43. That was roughly how many people had seen the guard strike a man on the Baron's orders. The ability counted that as coercion. 1 blow, 1 flash of violence from an authority figure, and 43 people no longer felt safe. Daniel summoned the guard. The guard stood before him, terrified. He thought he'd be punished for striking too lightly. Daniel told him the opposite. He said you must never hit anyone, at all, ever, under no circumstances. If someone starts a fight, you have to stop them with your hands. Pin them down, hold them back, but don't hit them. The guard looked at him as if he were crazy. Daniel explained it more simply. Every blow costs him money, a lot of money. The guard didn't understand, but nodded. On the evening of the 9th day, a caravan pulled up to the donjon. 15 wagons. Daniel went out to meet them and saw a woman on the first wagon, young, dark-skinned, black hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her clothes were travel wear, but of good quality. On her belt was a leather purse, so tightly stuffed that the seams were straining. She jumped down from the wagon and surveyed the camp. Then she looked at Daniel. She asked if he was the mad baron who paid in gold for refugees. Daniel replied that he wasn't entirely mad. She said her name was Minji Park and that she had salt, spices, and fabrics on her wagons. She was taking them to the capital, but had heard about Hollow March along the way and decided to check it out. If the Baron really paid in gold, she was ready to trade. If not, she'd move on. Daniel looked at the wagons. Salt. There was no salt in the camp for 4,000 people. Porridge without salt is just hot water with grains. People ate, but didn't feel full. Salt changed everything. He asked how much she wanted for the entire supply. Minji named a price. Daniel named another, 1/3 of hers. Minji laughed and said he was joking. Daniel replied that he wasn't joking and that he was offering her something better than a one-time deal. He was offering her a 1-year monopoly on salt in Hollow March. She would be the sole supplier, a fixed price, a guaranteed purchase volume. In return, she would open a trade route to the south and bring back whatever the province needed. Minji stopped laughing. She looked at him intently. She asked how he knew the word monopoly. Daniel replied that he'd learned it from books. Minji thought for a moment. Then she held out her hand. They shook hands right there by the wagon in the rain. That evening, for the first time, there was salt in the porridge. The people gathered around the cauldrons ate in silence. Some were crying, not out of grief, but because of the salt. It was the first time in weeks they'd felt that food was actually food, and not just a way to stay alive. On the 10th day, Daniel noticed a woman in the line for porridge. She wasn't standing like the others. The others stood slumped over. She stood up straight. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her dress was dirty, but her movements were precise, like those of someone accustomed to order. When her turn came, she took a bowl, and instead of sitting down to eat, she stood next to the pot and began serving, calmly, quickly, without a single unnecessary word. The line moved twice as fast with her there. Daniel approached her. He asked her name. She replied that her name was Helena Ashburn. He asked what she had done before becoming a refugee. She replied that she had been a baron's daughter, that her father had owned lands in the northeast, that her family had perished in a raid a year ago, that she had been walking ever since. Daniel asked if she knew how to count. Helena looked at him with an expression that could have set wet wood ablaze. She replied that she could count in 4 languages, that she knew the commercial law of 3 provinces, that she could calculate a tax statement in her head faster than he could say the word statement. Daniel nodded. He said he needed someone to manage the camp's entire operations, to keep records, to allocate resources, to make sure nothing went missing. Helena asked what he was offering in return. Daniel said he was offering a job, a real one, not charity. Helena was silent for 5 seconds. Then she nodded and asked for charcoal and a flat surface. An hour later, she had a complete list of all the camp's supplies. Daniel looked at her notes, and for the first time in 10 days, felt that he had a chance. Helena got to work, and the camp was transformed in 2 days. She divided people into categories: who was sick, who was healthy, who was good with their hands, who could cook, who had children, who had special skills. She went around every tent and every shelter and wrote everything down. Before that, Daniel had had 140 names in his head. 2 days later, Helena had a scroll with the names of all 4,000. Daniel looked at the scroll and thought that in his old world, this would be called a database. Helena called it a list of souls. The point was the same. They finally knew who they were feeding. The second week brought new problems. Water. The old well they had cleared on the first day provided enough water for 500 people. There were 4,000 of them. People were drinking from the river. The river was murky and slow-moving. Daniel knew what that meant. In his former world, he'd read reports about epidemics in refugee camps. Dirty water meant cholera, dysentery, mass deaths. He needed wells, lots of wells, quickly. Gareth said he knew 3 places where the water was close to the surface. Daniel sent crews there, 30 people per well. There weren't enough tools. People dug with sticks, with their hands, with whatever they could find. Daniel dug alongside them. Helena forbade him from digging because he was the only one who understood what was happening. And if he got sick, everything would fall apart. Daniel obeyed. Then he disobeyed and went to dig at night while she slept. Helena found out in the morning. She looked at him in silence. He expected her to scream. She simply said that if he died of exhaustion, she would personally write on his grave that here lies the most foolish baron in the history of the kingdom. Daniel promised not to dig at night anymore. He lied. On the 12th day, what he feared happened. 2 children fell ill, stomach aches, vomiting, fever, dirty water from the river. Daniel gathered everyone and forbade them from drinking from the river, only from the wells. The people grumbled because there were 2-hour lines at the wells. Daniel introduced a schedule. Each group would go to the well at its assigned time. The well would rest between groups. Helena wrote the schedule on parchment and hung it on a post by each well. 2 sick children were lying in the keep. Daniel didn't know how to treat them. He was an economist, not a doctor. Gareth said there was a healer living in a distant village, an old woman named Iris. Daniel sent for her. Iris arrived the next day. She was a large woman with a blacksmith's hands and a voice that made horses shudder. She looked at the sick children. She looked at the camp. She looked at Daniel. She said he was an idiot, that you can't keep 4,000 people without latrines, that the filth around the camp wasn't just filth, but a breeding ground for disease, that if he didn't set up proper toilets and hand-washing stations, in a week he wouldn't have 2 sick people, but 200. Daniel listened to everything. Then he asked if she would stay. Iris said she would stay, but only because of the children, and because that fool of a baron would ruin everyone without her. Daniel said he agreed with that assessment. Iris snorted and went to treat the children. Both children survived. Iris fed them herbal decoctions for 3 days. By the 4th day, they were already running around. Daniel stood and watched them run between the tents. Then he went down to the basement. There was no fine. The children were alive. The coins were still there. 2,411, more than yesterday. Every day the number grew. Every day, someone from the camp decided that this baron might be the real deal, that it might be worth staying. Daniel closed the chest and went upstairs. Iris caught up with him on the stairs and shoved a bowl of soup into his hands. She said he hadn't eaten again. Daniel tried to protest. Iris looked at him in such a way that he sat down and ate every last bit. The 3rd week began with a problem Daniel had anticipated but hoped to put off. They were running out of food. That first round of buying grain directly from the refugees had worked as a temporary measure, but the grain from the supply depots had long since run out. The porridge was getting thinner and thinner. Minji had brought salt and spices, but salt isn't food. The nearest market where they could buy grain was in the town of Cregford, a 4-day journey away. Prices there were exorbitant because the Baron of Cregford knew that Hollowmarch had no choice. Daniel sat poring over his budget on the wall, doing the math. 3,000 coins a day. Grain in Cregford cost 200 coins per wagon load. 1 wagon load fed the camp for 2 days. 8 days for the round trip back. That meant he'd have to send out caravans constantly, with overlapping schedules. At least 4 carts a week, 800 coins, plus wages for the carters, plus guards for the road. Over 1,000 coins a week just for grain. It was manageable, but it ate up a third of the budget. He needed another solution, a long-term one, his own. Daniel went to look for Gareth. He found the village headman on the western slope of the hill. Gareth was poking at the ground with his boot. Daniel asked what he was doing. Gareth replied that he was looking at the ground. Daniel asked what he saw. Gareth said he saw good soil, black earth beneath a layer of turf. This plain used to be farmland. 20 years ago, they sowed wheat and rye here. Then the people left and the land grew over. But it didn't die. It was resting. Daniel crouched down and scooped up a handful of soil. Dark, rich, moist from recent rains. He wasn't an agronomist, but even he could see that this wasn't a dead step. He asked Gareth how much they could plant. Gareth made a rough estimate. With the people they had and the tools they had, they could prepare 300 acres by summer. 300 acres would yield a first harvest by fall, not a bountiful one, but their own. Daniel nodded and said that 300 acres was a start. Then he asked if there were any people among the refugees who knew how to plow. Gareth replied that most of refugees from the east were farmers. They'd been plowing all their lives. Their land had been taken from them, but not their hands. Daniel announced that planting would begin the next day. He gathered the people at the keep, 4,000 people, tired, hungry, but alive. Daniel stood on the steps and said that he had land, a lot of land. He said that everyone who went out into the fields would receive their own plot, not for rent, not for temporary use, their own, forever. 5 acres per family. One condition: the first harvest goes into the communal pot. From the second harvest, everyone keeps 7/10 for themselves and gives 3/10 to the community. Daniel explained that this was a tax, but a fair tax, written down on paper, the same for everyone. Gareth stood nearby, watching the reaction. The crowd was silent. Then a man in the front row asked. He asked if it was true that the land would be his, for good. Daniel said it was true. The man asked what would happen if a new baron came after Daniel and took it away. Daniel said he wouldn't take it away, because he was now going to sign the decree in front of everyone and affix the baron's seal. And in this kingdom, a decree bearing the seal is law. Anyone who breaks the seal loses their title. Daniel took out the parchment. Helena had written the text in advance. Baron Hartwell's decree on the granting of land. Daniel signed it right there on the steps and pressed his ring into the wax. The seal came out clear and even. A man in the front row stared at the seal. Then he dropped to his knees, not before Daniel, but before the parchment. In this world, a signature with a seal meant more than a word, more than a promise. It was an oath woven into the very fabric of the law. The next morning, there were 4,200 coins in the chest. A leap, a huge leap. Daniel understood why. Land. He had given the people more than just food and shelter. He had given them a future. A plot of land meant they were no longer refugees. They were residents. They had a place that belonged to them. The ability reacted instantly. A content person is worth more than just a well-fed one. A person with hope is worth even more. They began plowing the fields on the 4th day of the 3rd week. There were no plows. Minji sent a messenger south with an order for 10 plows and a promise to pay double. Until the plows arrived, the people plowed with hoes, slowly, painfully, knee-deep in mud. Daniel walked through the fields and did the math. 1 acre per day for 10 people plowing by hand. 30 teams of 10 people each. 30 acres a day. 10 days until the first shipment of seeds. He'd ordered the seeds through Minji, wheat and rye, fast-growing varieties. Minji said she knew a supplier in the south. Daniel gave her 500 coins and told her he'd be waiting. Minji left at dawn. She returned 6 days later with 3 carts of seeds and with news. The neighboring baron, Craigford, had doubled the price of grain yet again. Daniel nodded. He'd expected this. The neighbors were starting to put pressure on him. The problems with the neighbors didn't start right away. At first, there were just rumors. Merchants passing through said that the barons in the east and north were laughing at the madman from Hollow March. They said he'd let all the scum off the roads into his territory, that his province wasn't a province at all, but a dump, that in a month he'd be drowning in his own refugees and would come running to ask for help. Daniel listened to these stories and said nothing. The laughter didn't bother him. Something else did. If his neighbors were laughing, it meant they weren't afraid yet. When they started to fear, things would get worse. 1 month, 30 days since his arrival. Daniel asked Helena to compile a report. Helena spread out her parchments on the table in the keep. The population of Hollow March numbered 5,300 people. Of these, 3,800 were of working age. There were 600 children under 12. There were 900 elderly and sick people. 120 tents and 80 temporary shelters made of wood and canvas had been built. There were 5 functioning wells. There were 20 latrines built according to Iris's plan. 110 acres had been planted. Porridge is distributed 3 times a day. 14 deaths this month. 2 births. Daniel listened and made notes with a charcoal stick on the wall. Then he added his own line. Today's treasury revenue is 4,900 coins a day. Helena looked at that figure. She asked where the money came from. Daniel said it was from the chest in the basement. Helena asked who put them there. Daniel said no one. They just appear on their own. Helena was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said she wouldn't ask any more questions. She could see the coins. The coins are real. That's enough. Daniel appreciated that. Helena was the kind of person who didn't waste time on questions with no answers. Daniel submitted his work card at the end of the first month, a simple wooden tag with a mark on it. Every adult received a tag in the morning. The tag was marked off for each day of work. With a marked tag, a person received a full portion of porridge and the right to an extra bowl for a child. Without a mark, the portion was smaller, but not 0. Daniel categorically rejected the idea of not feeding those who didn't work. The sick cannot work. The elderly cannot work. Mothers with infants cannot work. They received food for free. But a healthy adult who was able to work but didn't receive less, not as a punishment, as an incentive. Gareth said it was fair. Helena said it was reasonable. Iris said that was finally at least one smart idea from that boy. Daniel decided to take that as a compliment. The token system took off faster than he'd expected. People wanted to work, not because they were afraid of going hungry, because work gave them a sense of purpose. A refugee who sits in a tent all day eating someone else's porridge is a person with no future. A refugee who picks up a hoe in the morning, goes out to the field, and returns in the evening with a stamped tag is a person who has a purpose. Daniel knew this from Chicago. Programs that simply fed the homeless didn't work. Programs that provided work, and through that work provided food, always worked. The difference isn't in the food. The difference is in dignity. In the middle of the second month, Iris came to see Daniel. She brought a girl with her, thin, black-haired, about 18 or 19 years old, big, dark eyes, and hands stained green from herbs. Iris said this was Sora, a foundling. Iris had found her as a child by the roadside 15 years ago. The girl knows herbs better than Iris. She knows which root reduces fever, which leaf stops bleeding, which decoction helps with a cough. Iris said she needed help. There are a lot of people, and a lot of sick ones too. Iris can't handle it all on her own. Sora can work in the infirmary if the Baron allows it. Daniel looked at the girl. Sora stood with her eyes downcast. She was clutching a bunch of some herbs in her hands. Quiet, unobtrusive, one of those people who are used to being overlooked. Daniel asked her if she knew how to treat a fever. Sora answered without looking up. She listed 4 plants. She explained which one to use and in what proportions. She added that the root of the third one had to be gathered before dawn, otherwise it would lose its potency. She spoke quietly, but confidently, like someone who knows her craft. Daniel nodded and said she could start today. Sora looked up. Her eyes showed surprise. She had expected questions, scrutiny, conditions, but instead, she received simply permission. Iris slapped her on the back so hard that Sora nearly fell over and said, "Let's get to work." The third month began with good news. Minji returned from the south and brought not only seeds and fabric, but also 10 plows, real iron plows. Daniel never thought he'd be so happy about a piece of metal on a wooden frame. The plows sped up the plowing 5-fold. The 300 acres that Gareth had promised by summer were planted in 3 weeks. Daniel ordered them to start the second phase, another 200 acres south of the hill. Gareth said the soil there was poorer, rocky. Daniel replied that the rocks could be collected. They'd come in handy for house foundations. 2 birds with 1 stone. Gareth looked at him with that expression Daniel had already learned to recognize. The look of a man who hears an obvious idea and can't understand why he hadn't thought of it himself. The population was growing. By the beginning of the third month, 6,200 people were living in Hollow March. New refugees arrived every week, 200 at a time, 300 at a time. Word of the Baron who fed them and gave them land spread along the roads like wildfire through dry grass. Daniel couldn't stop them. He didn't want to. Every new person was a source of income, but every new person was also another mouth to feed, and a pair of hands that needed to be put to work, and a mind filled with its own grievances, its own gods, and its own truth. Every morning, Helena brought him an updated head count. The numbers were growing. The problems were growing along with them. Conflict between the groups had been smoldering since day one. The Eastern refugees spoke one dialect and prayed to the bright circle. The Southerners spoke another and revered the ancient spirits of the earth. The old-timers prayed to no one and considered all newcomers outsiders who would soon devour the last of their supplies. Daniel knew that sooner or later, the smoldering conflict would turn into a fire. It happened on the 4th day of the 3rd month. An eastern man named Talon caught a southern man named Brocco building a small stone altar to his spirits by the well. Talon said it defiled the water. Brocco replied that the water belonged to the spirits, not the church. Talon pushed the altar over. Brocco struck Talon. Within a minute, 20 men were fighting. Daniel's guards rushed in to break it up. Daniel ran up just as 2 men were already lying on the ground with their faces bloodied. He didn't shout. He didn't punish them. He ordered all the brawlers to be brought to the keep. They stood before him, 20 men, angry, battered, each convinced he was right. Daniel sat down on the steps and spoke quietly. He didn't address them as a baron. He spoke as a man who thinks things through. He asked Talon how long it had taken to dig the well next to which the altar stood. Talon didn't know. Daniel said 4 days, 40 men working 10 hours a day, 400 man-hours. Then he asked Brocco how many people drank from that well. Brocco didn't know. Daniel said 600. Then he said the fight at the well had lasted 3 minutes. During those 3 minutes, the well wasn't in use. 600 people didn't get their water on time. 4 were injured. 4 injured people mean a quarter of a coin each because the sick bring in less. He didn't say that out loud. Instead, he said something else. He said that everyone can pray to whomever they want, wherever they want. But a well isn't a temple. A well is water. Water for everyone. Altars can be set up anywhere except at wells, workshops, and warehouses. That's the rule. The first person to break it loses their work card for a week. Not their food, their card. The difference matters. They'll get food either way, but without the card, they won't get an extra portion, and everyone will know they broke the rule. Talon asked what would happen if the Southerners started it first. Daniel said, the rule applies equally to everyone. It doesn't matter who started it. Brocco asked what would happen if he were insulted. Daniel said that insults are words. You don't lose your card for words. Hands are actions. Actions are what? The people dispersed, dissatisfied, but compliant. Helena wrote the rule down on parchment. The first law of Hollow March. Common areas belong to everyone and belong to no one. A week after the incident at the well, Daniel did what Helena later called his best idea of the first quarter. He announced the construction of a communal bathhouse, not out of luxury, out of calculation. Iris had long insisted that dirty people are sick people. Sick people bring in a quarter of a coin. Clean people bring in a full one. The math was simple. The bathhouse would pay for itself in a week. But Daniel added a detail. The bathhouse was communal, not in the sense of one for everyone, but in the sense of for everyone. The old-timers from the east and south, everyone in the same line, everyone in the same water. People who wash side by side cease to be strangers. Daniel had seen this in Chicago. Public laundromats in immigrant neighborhoods did more for integration than all the city's programs combined. There's something about shared daily activities that breaks down barriers faster than any words. Daniel opened his first school at the end of the 3rd month. 12 children, 1 teacher. A refugee from the east named Barro, a former clerk for a minor official, literate, patient. Daniel found him while walking through the camp and saw him using a stick to draw letters in the dirt for 3 little ones who were standing around him with their mouths agape. Daniel approached him and offered him a job, a teacher at Baron Hartwey's. Barrow asked which school. Daniel pointed to an empty barn at the edge of the camp. This one, he said. Barrow looked at the barn. He looked at Daniel. He asked if he was serious. Daniel said he couldn't be more serious. A literate peasant is worth 5 times as much as an illiterate one after 3 years. He didn't say he meant that literally, that every literate craftsman earned 3 coins instead of 1. He said that literate people build better, work faster, and settle disputes with words rather than fists. Barrow agreed. A week later, in the barn, 12 children were sitting and learning to read. Daniel personally taught the first arithmetic lesson. He explained addition using pebbles. The children laughed. Daniel smiled. It was the first time in 3 months that he had smiled not out of relief, but out of joy. The fourth month, the first sprouts in the fields, green streaks on the gray earth. Gareth stood at the edge of the field and looked at them. His face looked as if he were witnessing a miracle. Daniel asked if everything was all right. Gareth replied that everything was fine. It was just that he had been looking at this land for 20 years and thought it was dead, but it had simply been waiting. Daniel nodded. The land had been waiting. The people had been waiting. This whole place had been waiting. The thought made him uneasy. It was too much like fate, and he didn't believe in fate. He believed in planning. In the middle of the fourth month, something happened that changed everything. A horseman rode up to the camp gates. Not a refugee, not a merchant, a warrior, on a fine horse, in chainmail, with a coat of arms on his cloak that Gareth recognized immediately. The coat of arms of Count Osmond Vereker, their eastern neighbor, an old noble family. The warrior dismounted and demanded an audience with the Baron. Daniel went out to meet him. The warrior delivered a message. Count Vereker demanded that Baron Hartwell return all the refugees who had come from the Count's lands. He demanded that the Baron stop accepting new ones. He demanded compensation for the loss of labor. The amount of compensation was specified separately and equaled the annual income of an average province. Daniel read the message. He reread it. He rolled it up and tucked it into his belt. Then he asked the warrior if he wanted something to eat. The warrior looked flustered. Daniel invited him over to the cauldron. The warrior ate porridge with salt and looked around the camp, at the temporary shelters, at the people working in the fields, at the children running past, shouting. Then he said he hadn't expected this. Daniel asked what exactly. The warrior replied that he had expected mud and chaos, but what he saw was something strange. Daniel asked what was so strange. The warrior thought for a moment and said that the people here didn't look like refugees. They looked as if they'd been living here for a long time. Daniel nodded and asked him to tell the Count that the refugees wouldn't be returning, that they were now citizens of Hollow March. They had land and the Baron's seal. As for compensation, let the Count demand it from those who drove their peasants to flee. The warrior left. Helena approached and said that he wasn't just a messenger, he was a scout. The Count wanted to see with his own eyes what was happening here. Daniel replied that he knew, and that he had deliberately shown the warrior the camp. Let him tell the Count. Let the Count know that people live here, not livestock. Helena asked if he wasn't afraid that the Count would send an army instead of a messenger. Daniel said he was afraid, but an army costs money, and the Count had already lost half of those who earned that money. Time was on Daniel's side. Every day, literally, the fifth month. Minji opened a trade route to the south. 3 caravans a month. Salt went north. Grain came from the south. Fabrics traveled both ways. Minji hired guards for the caravans, 20 strong men from among the former refugees. Daniel paid their wages from the treasury. Not much, but steady. Minji said that in her 24 years of life, no one had ever given her a seal or told her she represented anyone other than herself. Daniel replied that she didn't represent him. She represented Hollow March. The distinction was important. Minji remained silent for the rest of the evening after that. Helena later told Daniel that she had seen Minji sitting by the campfire at night, examining the seal with the provincial coat of arms that Daniel had given her for trade documents. Daniel asked if she had been crying. Helena said she didn't know. It was dark. Sixth month. Population 11,000. Revenue 22,000 coins per day. Daniel stared at the numbers and couldn't believe them. 22,000. 6 months ago, he had 87, a 250-fold increase. In his old world, numbers like that were typical of startups a second before they crashed and burned. But this wasn't a startup. These were real people. 11,000 people, each of whom morning added a coin to his chest. Because they wanted to live here. They weren't forced to. They wanted to. Daniel sat in the dungeon's basement amid sacks of gold and thought about how no one in Chicago would believe him. A city official who proved that investing in people pays off in gold, literally. It was at that very moment that death came, quietly, without warning. Daniel was having dinner in the communal dining hall, a long table under a canopy. Gareth and 2 elders from the new settlements were sitting nearby. Helena had gone to check the warehouses. Iris was in the infirmary. Minjay had left with the caravan. A man emerged from the crowd, an ordinary face, ordinary clothes. He drew the knife when he was already 2 steps away from Daniel. Daniel saw the knife and didn't have time to do anything. Didn't have time to scream. Didn't have time to jump up. Didn't even have time to be afraid. But someone else did. The woman who had been working in the kitchen for the past 2 weeks. Quiet, unobtrusive, the kind you don't remember. With a single movement, she grabbed the hand holding the knife. With a second, she broke the attacker's wrist. With a third, she pinned his face to the table and pressed his own knife to his throat. It all took 3 seconds. The dining hall fell silent. Daniel stared at the woman. She was short, lean, with short, dark hair and a face that betrayed no emotion, like a mask. Daniel asked who she was. She replied briefly, Kaide, a former palace guard. She had been watching him for 2 weeks. She had come to determine whether he was worth protecting. She decided he was. After the assassination attempt, Kaide didn't leave Daniel's side for a moment. She slept by the door to his room. She ate standing up. She kept an eye on anyone who came within 3 steps of him. On the 3rd day, Daniel told her she could sit down. Kaide replied that she could see better while standing. Daniel said she wasn't obligated to stand 20 hours a day. Kaide replied that she was obligated because she had made the decision to protect him. Daniel asked why she had made that decision. Kaide was silent for a long time. Then she said that her whole life she had been a weapon in the hands of others. The palace guards aren't people, they're tools. She was given orders and she obeyed. Once, she was ordered to kill an unarmed man, a petitioner who had come to the king with a complaint. She refused. For that, she was declared a deserter. She fled and went into hiding for a year. Then she heard about Hollow March and came to take a look. 2 weeks in the kitchen. She listened. She watched. She saw how the Baron walked unguarded among thousands of strangers. She saw him ask for names. She saw him bury the dead. She decided that this man was doing what she had been waiting for her whole life. That was worth fighting for. Daniel listened. Then he said one thing. He said that Kaide wasn't his sword. She was a citizen of Hollow March who happened to have a sword. The difference was enormous. Kaide didn't answer, but something in her expression changed. Something small, barely noticeable, as if a wall inside her, one that had stood for a very long time, had cracked. Daniel instructed her to form a militia, not an army. He was adamant about this. An army is a tool of offense. A militia is a tool of defense. The difference isn't in size, but in purpose. Kaide asked what exactly the difference was. Daniel explained, an army obeys orders. A militia defends its home. A soldier goes where he's told. A militiaman stands where he lives. A soldier receives a salary for obedience. A militiaman receives safety for his family. Kaide listened and nodded. Then she asked how many people were needed. Daniel said, start with 50. Strong, healthy volunteers. Only volunteers. No coercion. Anyone who doesn't want to go doesn't have to. Kaide recruited 50 men in 2 days. There were 3 times as many who wanted to join. She selected those she deemed fit. She began training them on the field behind the keep, sticks instead of swords, sandbags instead of shields. Kaide put them through their paces from dawn till dusk, strictly, harshly, but without striking them. She remembered Daniel's words, that violence costs money. When one militiaman struck another during training, Kaide didn't punish him. She made him run around the camp 10 times, and then asked why he'd hit him. The militiaman said his partner had insulted him. Kaide asked which was more important, his pride or food for his children. The militiaman didn't answer, but he didn't hit anyone again. By the middle of the 7th month, Count Veriker's pressure had intensified. The first sign appeared at night. A grain warehouse on the southern outskirts caught fire. Daniel ran over with everyone else and helped put out the fire. They lost 1/3 of their supply. Helena calculated the losses, 600 coins to replenish the stock. Kaide found traces, oil on the walls of the warehouse, arson. Strangers' boot prints led eastward, toward Veriker's lands. Daniel stood by the charred walls and did the math, not the losses. He was calculating how much the Count was willing to spend on sabotage. The arsonist was a mercenary. A mercenary had to be paid. Oil had to be bought and brought in. These are expenses. The Count spends money on destruction. Daniel spends money on construction. The question is, whose money will run out first? The answer was obvious, the Count's, because destruction doesn't generate income, but construction does. Every new house means a new resident. Every new resident means money. The Count can burn down 10 warehouses. Daniel will build 20. Math. But math didn't protect against knives. A week after the fire, the well was poisoned. Not the one they were digging, the old one, the first one, the very one they'd cleared out on the first day. In the morning, 3 people fell ill with severe stomach cramps. Iris identified the poison. Hemlock root ground into powder. Sora helped nurse the poisoned people back to health for 2 days. All 3 survived. Daniel forbade the use of the well and ordered it cleaned out to the bottom. Kaide posted guards at all the wells, 2 people at each, around the clock. It was wearing down the militia, but there was no choice. Poisoned water is no joke. It means mass death. Daniel convened a council, the first real council in the history of Hollow March. Gareth, Helena, Minji, Iris, Kaide. Sora sat in the corner and remained silent, but Daniel insisted she be there. He spread a map out on the table, a rough one, drawn with charcoal on a piece of cloth. Hollow March in the center, Veriker's lands to the east, Craigford to the north, the unclaimed lands to the west, Minji's trade route to the south. Daniel said they had a problem. Count Veriker wouldn't stop at arson and poisoning. The next step would be raids, small detachments, nighttime attacks on outlying settlements. The goal wasn't to destroy Hollow March, but to intimidate the people. If the people got scared and start leaving, the treasury will run dry. If the treasury runs dry, Daniel won't be able to build. If he can't build, people will get even more scared. A downward spiral. Veriker doesn't know about the treasury, but he's instinctively striking at the right spot. The people's confidence and their desire to stay. Kaede said they needed walls. Helena said walls cost money and manpower. Minji said there was money, but people were needed in the fields. Gareth said walls were useless if there was no one to defend them. Sora remained silent. Daniel listened to everyone. Then he said there would be walls, but not stone ones. There wasn't time for stone walls. An earthen rampart with a palisade, not around the entire settlement, only around the center, the keep, the warehouses, the infirmary, the school, a ring with a diameter of 1/4 of a mile. Beyond the rampart would be the fields and temporary shelters. If there were a raid, the rampart would protect what was most valuable. People from the outer ring would take shelter behind the rampart. Then they'd return and rebuild. Kaede said that made sense. Helena calculated how many people would be needed for the construction. 500 for 10 days. Minji said she would provide the tools. Gareth said he knew where to get clay for reinforcement. Daniel nodded. The council meeting ended. Everyone went off to do their part. It took 12 days to build the rampart, not 10 as planned, because it rained for 3 days and the clay became too wet to work with. 500 people dug, carried, and tamped down the earth. Kaede supervised the work. She turned out to be not only a warrior, but also an engineer. She knew how to set up a palisade so it wouldn't collapse in the wind. She knew where to leave passages. She knew how high the rampart had to be so that a horseman couldn't leap over it. Daniel asked how she knew all this. Kaede replied that the palace guard was trained not only to kill, but also to defend. Daniel nodded. The rampart stood, rough, not very high, but sufficient. Behind it were the keep, all the warehouses, the infirmary, the school, and 200 temporary shelters for those who lived closest to the center. The 8th month, harvest. Hollow March's first real harvest. Wheat had sprouted in the fields that Gareth had considered dead. Not a bountiful harvest, but their own. Daniel stood at the edge of the field and watched as the people reaped. With sickles, with their hands. Some were crying, not out of grief. They had sown this wheat with their own hands on the land the Baron had given them with his seal, and now it had grown. Their wheat, on their land. Gareth walked over and stood beside him. He was silent for a moment. Then he said quietly that the land really wasn't dead. It had been waiting. Daniel said nothing. He wanted to say that it wasn't about the land. It was about the people. The land waits for nothing. People are the ones who wait. But he remained silent because sometimes silence speaks louder than words. They harvested the crop in 2 weeks. Helena did the math. 800 cartloads of wheat, 200 cartloads of rye. That would be enough to feed 11,000 people for 3 months. Not a lavish amount, but enough to stave off hunger. For the first time, Hollow March could feed itself without buying supplies from Craigford, without relying on the kindness of neighbors. On its own, Daniel gathered the people in the square in front of the keep. 11,000 faces. He stood on the steps and spoke briefly. "This is your bread. You grew it on your land with your own hands. No one gave it to you out of charity. You earned it." The crowd was silent for a second. Then someone shouted. Then another. Then everyone shouted. Daniel stood there listening to the shout and felt a warm pulsation in his chest, beating in time with it. The next morning, there were 31,000 coins in the chest. Daniel counted them twice. 31,000. A leap. Not a gradual increase. A leap. The harvest and his words in the square had achieved what months of porridge and shelter had failed to do. The people felt that this was their home, not a camp, not a temporary refuge. Home, a place where they had grown their own bread. Their resilience had kicked in. A content person is worth 2 coins. A person who has a home, a harvest, and work is worth 3. 11,000 people at 3 coins each. 33,000, minus penalties for the sick and minus those who don't yet feel completely at home. Total, 31,000. Daniel sat in the basement amid the gold and counted. Then he went upstairs. He found Helena. He told her it was time to build a mill. Helena looked at him. She asked why they needed a mill. Daniel explained, grain is just grain. Flour is a product. The price difference is fourfold. If they sold flour instead of grain, each wagon load would cost 4 times as much. A mill isn't just a convenience. A mill is processing. It's added value. He didn't use those exact words. Instead, he put it more simply. If you sell apples, you'll get a copper coin. If you sell apple pie, you'll get a silver one. Helena nodded. She said she understood. Then she asked if he knew how to build mills. Daniel said no, but he knew the principle. Water turns the wheel turns the millstone grinds the grain. Helena said that a principle isn't a blueprint. Daniel agreed. He said they needed an engineer, or at least a carpenter who'd seen a mill. Helena promised to look for one. She found him 3 days later, an old carpenter from among the southern refugees named Gregor. He'd built mills before the war, 3 of them. All of them had burned down during raids. Gregor was a broken man. He drank whenever he could find something to drink. He slept in a ditch. Daniel went to see him in person. He sat down on the ground next to him. Not on a step, not on a chair. On the ground, right next to him. He said he needed a mill. Gregor replied that mills burn down. Daniel said that everything burns down, but they need flour every day. Gregor looked at him with cloudy eyes. Daniel took a sheet of parchment out of his pocket, a contract written by Helena. Gregor was to be hired as the head miller of Hollow March. Salary, housing, a workshop. The Baron's seal beneath the text. Gregor looked at the parchment, then at Daniel, then back at the parchment. He asked why the Baron was signing the contract. He was just a simple carpenter. Daniel replied that the contract wasn't a favor. A contract was a commitment. The Baron was obligated to pay. The miller was obligated to build. Both parties are equal before the seal. Gregor took the parchment. His hands were shaking. He hadn't had a drink in 2 days because there was nothing to drink. But that wasn't why they were shaking. He asked if he could keep the parchment. Daniel said that was his copy. The second copy would remain with Helena. Gregor pressed the parchment to his chest and said he would start tomorrow. The mill was built in a month, on the riverbank. The river was shallow, but Gregor knew how to position the wheel so that even a weak current would provide power. The millstones were hewn from stone gathered in the fields. Daniel paid for every stage of the work, every nail, every beam, every hour of labor. Everything was recorded. Helena kept the accounts with a precision that made Daniel's heart skip a beat. She didn't know the word bookkeeping, but that was exactly what she was doing. One evening, Daniel showed her the principle of double-entry bookkeeping. Every transaction is recorded twice, income and expense. If the totals don't match, there's a mistake somewhere. Helena listened, then she closed her eyes, then she opened them. Then she said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard in her life. Daniel said that's usually what people say about music, not accounting. Helena replied that he hadn't heard any bad music in the border taverns. Daniel laughed. It was the first time in 6 months that he'd truly laughed. Helena looked at him, and there was something new in her weary eyes, something she hadn't yet found a name for. The mill started up at the beginning of the 9th month. Gregor brought the first sack of flour to Daniel personally. White, fine, real flour. Daniel took a pinch and rubbed it between his fingers. Then he looked at Gregor. The old carpenter had the face of a man who had returned from the dead. He stood upright. His hands didn't shake. His eyes were clear. He had built the mill, the 4th one in his life, and this one won't burn down because it had guards and a rampart and a baron with a seal. Daniel thanked him. Gregor nodded and went back to his mill. He now spent the night there, not because he had to, because he wanted to. By the 10th month, Hollow March had 2 mills. The first was on the river. The second was a windmill. Gregor had built it on his own initiative. He'd come to Daniel with a blueprint, not on parchment, on a board, drawn with charcoal. He said the winds here were strong and steady. The watermill only worked in the summer when the river was full. In the winter, the water would freeze. A second one was needed, a windmill. Daniel looked at the drawing and recognized something familiar in it. The principle was the same as what he'd seen in the pictures in his school textbook. 4 blades, a shaft, a millstone. Gregor had figured it out on his own, without textbooks, without the internet, simply because he was a skilled craftsman who'd rediscovered his purpose. Daniel approved the drawing and allocated the funds. The mill was built in 3 weeks, the 11th month. Population, 14,000. Daniel stood on the embankment and looked out at what had been an empty plain just a year ago. Now, within the ring, stood the stone foundations of future buildings. The blacksmiths and carpenters' workshops had been smoking since dawn. The market was open 3 days a week. Gregor was building the 3rd mill. The school had moved from a barn to a proper building with a tiled roof, the tiles they'd started firing a month ago. Daniel looked at it all and thought that in his old world, something like this would have taken 5 years of approvals and 3 lawsuits from neighbors. Here, all it took was 10 months and a single chest of gold. But the problems were growing along with the town. Minji had returned from the south with bad news. Baron Craigford in the north had closed his section of the Holomarch caravan route. Officially, it was due to road repairs. In reality, it was because flour from Holomarch was driving down prices in his market. The southern route remained open, but it was long and passed through wild lands where bandits ran rampant. Minji had lost a biggest carrying her goods last week. The guards fought them off, but one was wounded. Daniel sat poring over the map, deep in thought. Relying on a single trade route meant dependence. He needed a second one, to the west. There were unclaimed lands and small settlements there that weren't under the control of any baron. Minji said the western route could be opened, but it would take time and money. Daniel said he had the money, but no time. Minji raised an eyebrow and said he says that every time. Daniel agreed. He said he was used to working under deadlines. Minji asked what a deadline was. Daniel explained that it's a deadline after which everything falls apart. Minji nodded and said that among her people it's called the last tide. When the water recedes, the boat must be out at sea or it will remain on the shore forever. Minji set off for the west with 3 wagons and 10 guards. Daniel gave her 200 gold pieces for expenses and the authority to conclude deals on behalf of the province. Minji weighed the purse in her hand and said that just a year ago, no one in the world would have trusted a half-blood from the southern islands to represent an entire province. Daniel replied that the province was glad to be represented by the best merchant on the continent. Minji snorted and told him not to flatter her because she would take her 5% anyway. Daniel said he deserved 7. Minji froze. Then she said 6 and not a coin more. Daniel nodded. Minji left at dawn. Helena stood next to Daniel and watched the caravan drive away. She said quietly that he had just given her more than she'd asked for. Daniel nodded. He said he knew. A person who is overpaid doesn't work for money. He works for respect, and respect can't be bought. Helena looked at him for a long moment and said that sometimes he says things that make her want to write them down. Daniel replied that it was simply economics. Helena shook her head and went back to her parchments. The 12th month, a year. A whole year had passed since the day the carriage came to a stop on the rutted road. Daniel asked Helena to compile the annual report. Helena spread the parchments out on the large table in the keep's hall. The population of Holomarch was 17,200 people. There were 900 residential buildings. Of these, 42 had stone foundations. There were 3 mills, 5 workshops, 1 blacksmith shop, 1 potter's workshop, 1 weaving workshop, 1 school for 80 students, an infirmary with 20 beds, 14 working wells. There were 2 public bathhouses, 600 acres of cultivated fields. The wheat harvest for the first year was 3,000 carts. The militia numbered 120 men. There were 2 trade routes, the southern and the western. Daniel listened and nodded. Then he added his own figures. Average daily revenue, 38,000 coins. Deaths for the year, 112. 91 birth. Fines for lost subjects totaled 2,000 coins for the entire year. Helena wrote everything down. Then she looked up and asked if he would celebrate. Daniel asked what there was to celebrate. Helena said the year. 1 year. From nothing to a city. Daniel thought for a moment. He said yes, there would be a celebration. A fair, open to everyone. Let merchants from neighboring provinces come. Let them see. Helena nodded and began to plan. The fair was scheduled for the end of the 12th month. 2 weeks before it began, the first merchants arrived. Not from neighboring villages, from distant provinces. They had come to see the Mad Baron, about whom the stories grew stranger and stranger. Daniel greeted each one personally. He showed them the mills. He showed them the workshops. He showed them the school. The merchants walked around in silence. One of them later told Helena that he'd come to laugh, but was leaving with an order for 200 sacks of flour. Helena relayed this to Daniel. Daniel nodded and said that laughter is the best advertisement. Helena asked what advertising was. Daniel explained. Helena thought for a moment and said that in this world, it's called word of mouth. Daniel agreed. Word of mouth. So be it. A week before the fair, an ambassador arrived. Not from the baron, not from a merchant, from the capital. A young man in fine clothes bearing the seal of the royal chancellery. He introduced himself as a secretary with the Treasury Department and reported that the Treasury was concerned about the unexplained growth in trade in the province of Holomarch. The department was sending an auditor to examine Baron Hartwell's financial activities. The auditor would arrive within a month. Daniel listened. He thanked the envoy. He fed him. He showed him the fairgrounds. The envoy left. Helena said this was bad. An auditor from the capital wasn't an audit. It was an accusation. Someone at court had already decided that Daniel was up to no good. All that was left only to prove it. Daniel replied that they should come. Let them investigate. He had nothing to hide. Helena looked at him, then at the seller, then back at him. She said that a chest of gold appearing out of nowhere was exactly what nothing to hide meant. Daniel said nothing. She was right, but there was no other way out. The fair opened on the last day of the 12th month. Daniel didn't set it up like a typical marketplace. He set it up like a showcase. Long tables stood in the square in front of the keep. Everyone was seated at them. Merchants from the 4 provinces sat next to peasants. Ambassadors sat next to artisans. Children from the school ran between the tables. Porridge with meat, bread made from their own flour, beer brewed by southern refugees using their own recipe. Minji had brought spices and seasonings from the west. The tables smelled so strong that people stopped in their tracks and closed their eyes. Daniel sat in the center between Gareth and Helena. Kaede stood behind him. Sora sat at the far end of the table and was feeding the 3 children she had nursed back to health from a fever last month. Iris walked among the tables, making sure everyone was eating. If anyone wasn't eating, Iris would approach and place a bowl in front of them so that it was impossible to refuse. The auditor arrived 3 weeks after the fair. Her name was Lydia Wainwright, 31 years old, tall, thin, icy gray eyes. Her clothes were travel-worn but immaculate, not a speck of dirt on her cloak after 4 days on horseback. Daniel decided that she either changed her cloaks every evening or possessed a supernatural ability to repel dust. 2 assistants and a convoy of 6 royal guards arrived with her. The guards set up camp in a tent by the gate. The assistants took a room in the keep. Lydia asked for a separate desk and access to all the books. Helena gave her everything, every parchment, every entry, every contract. Daniel ordered that nothing be hidden. Helena even asked for the income records. Daniel said even those, everything except the basement. He locked the basement and hung the key around his neck. Lydia worked, silently, methodically. She checked every line in Helena's records, every contract, every receipt, every entry for the issuance of grain and tools. She calculated faster than anyone Daniel had ever seen in this world. Her fingers flew across the lines. Her eyes moved like a machine. On the first day, she went through 3 months' worth of records. On the second, another 3. By the end of the 3rd day, she had checked half a year's worth and found not a single discrepancy. Helena kept perfect records. Daniel knew that. Lydia had discovered it, and that alarmed her more than any mistake. On the 4th day, Lydia asked Daniel for a private conversation. They sat down in the keep's hall. Lydia placed a stack of parchments in front of her. She said that the records were flawless, that she hadn't found a single irregularity, that every coin that entered the provincial treasury was documented. Every coin that left was documented as well. But there was one problem: the inflow. Trade generated revenue, but not enough to account for the scale of the construction. The mills, the workshops, the school, the militia, the purchases of grain and tools during the first few months, when there was no trade yet. Where did the money come from? Daniel remained silent. Lydia waited. She was patient. She had imprisoned more nobles than any inquisitor in the kingdom. She knew how to wait. Daniel said he had a source of income he couldn't explain. Lydia raised an eyebrow. Daniel said it wasn't counterfeiting. The coins were real, royal mint. They appeared every morning. He didn't know how. He doesn't know why. He only knows that they're connected to people. The more people who live in Hollow March, and the better they live, the more coins there are. Lydia looked at him. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then she said it was the most unusual confession she'd heard in 9 years on the job. Usually people tell her they found treasure, or that an uncle left them an inheritance, or that they won at craps. No one had ever said that money just appeared. Daniel nodded and said he understood how it sounded. He suggested she check for herself. Tomorrow at dawn. The basement, the chest. Lydia agreed. At dawn, they went down to the basement. Daniel unlocked the chest. He lifted the lid. Lydia stood nearby and watched. The chest was empty. Daniel had taken out all the coins the night before and given them to Helena for expenses. An empty bottom, old wood, nothing. They stood there and waited. The first ray of sunlight broke through a crack in the basement wall. And the chest filled up. Not instantly, not in a flash. The coins appeared like water filling a bowl, slowly, quietly. The golden clink layered upon the golden clink. Lydia stood motionless. Her face didn't change. Not a single muscle twitched. But Daniel saw her hands. Her fingers were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The coins kept coming for a minute, 2, 3. Then they stopped. The chest was full. Daniel said it was 39,000 today, give or take. Lydia reached out and took 1 coin. She turned it over in her hand. She looked at the obverse and reverse. She bit the edge. She weighed it in her hand. Genuine, royal mint, minted last year, indistinguishable from any coin in the kingdom. Lydia put the coin back. She was silent for 2 minutes. Then she said she needed to think it over, and she left. Lydia thought about it for 3 days. She didn't speak to anyone. She walked around town. She visited workshops. She ate with the peasants in the communal dining hall. She went into the school and sat on the back bench, listening to Barrow teach the children to read. She visited the infirmary where Sora was bandaging a boy's scraped knee while explaining to his mother how to make a cough remedy. Lydia watched Sora for a long time. Then she approached her and asked how many people she had treated in a year. Sora lowered her eyes and said quietly that it was more than 2,000. Lydia nodded and left. On the fourth day, she returned to Daniel. She said she would write 2 reports. The first for the Treasury. It would state that Baron Hartwell's financial activities contained no irregularities, that the province's revenues were due to successful trade and the population's high productivity, that no evidence of counterfeiting had been found. Daniel asked about the second report. Lydia said the second one was for herself. In it, she would record everything she had seen, the chest, coins, the connection between people's well-being and revenue. She doesn't understand how it works, but she's seen that it works and that it's right. Daniel asked what she planned to do with this second report. Lydia said nothing for now. She wants to stay, to continue observing. Daniel asked how long. Lydia replied that she'd stay until she figured it out. Daniel nodded. Lydia stayed. She took a room in the keep and began working, not as an auditor, but as an advisor. She knew the kingdom's laws better than anyone in Hollow March. She knew the procedures, she knew the pitfalls, she knew how the nobility evaded taxes and how the treasury caught them doing so. Daniel began discussing every new decree with her. They would sit in the keep's hall in the evenings and debate about tax rates, about trade licenses, about land rights, about what property is and to whom it belongs. Daniel explained concepts from his world to her: progressive taxation, antitrust regulations, public goods. Lydia listened and asked questions that made Daniel fall silent for a moment, because the questions were more precise than anything he'd heard from his professors at the university. Once she asked him why he spent money on schools if children didn't pay taxes. Daniel replied that children do pay taxes. In 20 years, a skilled craftsman earns 5 times more than an uneducated peasant. School is an investment with a deferred return. Lydia was silent. Then she said that in the capital he would be declared a heretic for such an idea. Daniel replied that in his homeland, it's called budget planning. Lydia smiled, for the first time ever. It was a small smile, almost imperceptible, but Helena noticed, and Daniel noticed that Helena had noticed. The 13th month, population 21,000. New people were arriving not only as refugees, now artisans were coming. Blacksmiths, carpenters, mason, people who had heard that in Hollow March there was work, that they paid fairly, and that no one was beaten. They came from neighboring provinces, from Baron Craigford's lands, from Count Veriker's lands. Daniel welcomed them all, a contract for each. A plot of land for each, a seal for each. Helena kept track of everything and said that if this continued, she would need assistance. Daniel gave her 3 young, literate people from Barrow School. The first graduates, not quite graduates, since the school had been open for less than a year, but they could read, count, and write in neat handwriting. That was enough. Helena trained them in 2 weeks. Daniel watched her work with them and thought that in his former world, she would have been the CEO of a corporation. Here, she was the administrator of a province that hadn't existed a year ago. Something unexpected happened in the 14th month. Count Veriker assembled an army, not a band of mercenaries, not a gang of arsonists, a full-fledged army. 800 men, infantry, cavalry, siege wagons. Daniel learned of this from a scout whom Kaidi sent east every 3 days. The scout rode up on a dust-covered horse and reported that the army had set out and would reach the borders of Hollow March in 4 days. Daniel called a council. Everyone was there: Helena, Kaide, Minji, Gareth, Iris, Sora, Lydia. 7 people gathered around the table with the map. Kaede reported, "The militia numbers 170 men. They are trained in defensive combat, armed with spears and shields, 30 bows, 20 swords. The rampart and palisade are in good condition. We have enough arrows for 2 hours of heavy fire. That's not enough against 800 trained soldiers." Kaede said this bluntly, without fear, as a matter of fact. Minji suggested sending a messenger to the capital to request help. Lydia shook her head. She said the capital wouldn't send help to an exiled baron. It would likely be glad if Veriker solved the problem for them. Gareth remained silent. Then he said that he was old and had seen many wars, and that in every war, it's the innocent who die the most. Daniel nodded. He knew that. War destroys what he's been building for a year. Every death means a loss of 10 coins. Every frightened person meant a loss of part of his income. Every person who fled meant a total loss. If Veriker's army reached the city, people would flee. Not everyone, but many would, because they'd already fled once and knew what it looked like when the soldiers arrived. Daniel stood over the map and thought, 800 soldiers. What does Veriker feed them? Where does their pay come from? He asked Kaede if she knew how much it cost to maintain such an army. Kaede replied that she did. She'd served in the palace guard. 800 men, pay, provisions, a supply train, horse fodder, about 200 gold pieces a day on the march, 300 during a siege. Daniel did the math. 300 gold pieces a day. Veriker had lost half his peasants in a year. His income had plummeted. Taxes weren't being collected. Trade had slumped. Where did he get the money for the army? Lydia raised her hand. She said she knew where. A loan. Veriker had borrowed money. From whom? Daniel asked. Lydia replied that it was most likely from Baron Craigford up north, or from someone in the capital. Whoever provided the money wants Hollow March to disappear. This isn't just a grudge held by an old count. It's a coalition. Daniel nodded. That changed the situation. If Veriker had backing from the capital, then even a victory in a single battle wouldn't solve the problem. There would be a second, a third, until the money runs out, or until Daniel is gone. He made his decision that night, alone. Standing on the keep's ramparts and gazing at the lights of 21,000 hearths. In the morning, he convened the council and announced that he would not fight. Kaede looked at him with a heavy heart. She said she hadn't trained the militia just to have them stand around doing nothing. Daniel said the militia would stand on the walls, armed, visible, but not attacking. He himself would go out to face Veriker's army, alone, unarmed. Helena said no, just no, in a single word. Kaede said she wouldn't allow it. Minji said he'd lost his mind. Iris said that if he went out through the gate alone, she would personally tie him to a post. Gareth was silent. Sora was silent. Lydia was silent. Daniel raised his hand and everyone fell silent. He explained. Veriker's 800 soldiers weren't a professional army. They were peasants and farmhands who'd been rounded up for service or hired for a few coins. They didn't want to fight. They wanted to eat. They wanted to live. They'd heard about Hollow March. Everyone had. The Baron who feeds them. The Baron who gives them land. The Baron who doesn't beat them. A soldier standing in front of a wall with a spear has only one thought, that behind that wall there is food, shelter, and work. And behind his back is a count who pays 2 copper coins and feeds them rotten, salted meat. Daniel isn't going to fight. He's going to make an offer to every soldier personally. 100 gold coins. Food, a roof over their heads, a place in the city, right now, no strings attached. Kaede said he couldn't buy off the army. Daniel said he could. 800 men at 100 coins each is 80,000. In 2 days, he'll have 78,000 in his treasury, plus Helena's reserves. That'll be enough. Lydia looked up at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Not surprise, not fear. Something resembled recognition, as if she had seen in him someone she had long been searching for. Veriker's army appeared on the horizon on the 4th day, exactly as the scout had predicted. A long column of dust on the eastern road. The militia stood on the rampart. Kaede had lined them up in full armor, shields, spears, bows drawn, visible, ready, but with orders not to fire, under no circumstances. Kaede relayed this order to each of them personally. Some of the militiamen didn't understand. Kaede said that the Baron knew what he was doing. She herself wasn't entirely sure, but she had decided to trust him and had no intention of changing her mind. Daniel stepped out through the gate when the army was 200 paces away, alone, unarmed, without a cloak bearing the coat of arms, in a plain shirt. Behind him, Helena stood on the wall, holding her breath. Kaede stood next to Helena, gripping the hilt of her sword so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Minji stood by the gate with the sacks of gold she'd been hauling all morning. Iris stood in the infirmary, preparing bandages. Sora stood beside her, praying, not to the gods, to the herbs. She begged them to be stronger than swords. The army came to a halt. At the forefront was a rider on a black horse, an old man, gray-haired, back straight, a heavy sword at his belt. Count Osmond Veriker. Daniel recognized the coat of arms. Veriker recognized him, too. He looked down on him, as if at an insect. Daniel stopped 100 paces from the front ranks. He raised his hands to show he was unarmed. Then he spoke, loudly, so that not only the front ranks, but also the back ranks could hear him. He wasn't addressing Veriker. He was addressing the soldiers. He said he knew why they were there. They had been ordered. They had obeyed. That was what they had done their whole lives. They obeyed. They were told to plow, and they plowed. They were told to fight, and they fought. They were told to die, and they died. But he was offering something different. He was offering each of them a choice. Right now, 100 gold coins, a hot meal, a roof over their heads, 5 acres of land, a place in the city where they won't be beaten or chased away, and where their children will go to school. Right now, no strings attached. Anyone who wants to can lower their weapon and walk toward the gate. No one will lay a hand on them. No one will stop them. Daniel fell silent. Silence. The next morning, after Vereker left, there were 101,000 coins in the chest. Daniel counted them. Then he counted them again. 101,000. It was more than when before, more than he could explain with simple arithmetic. 21,000 residents plus 700 newcomers. Even if everyone had contributed 4 coins, the total wouldn't add up. Then he heard a voice. For the first time in a year, the voice spoke something other than an accounting entry. One word: recognized. Daniel stood in the basement, listening the silence after that word. Then he closed the chest and went upstairs. He had to find places for over 700 new residents. It was a task that took up the entire following week. Helena worked 20 hours a day. She recorded names. She assigned them to work crews. She designated plots of land. Many of the former soldiers had been farmers before they were drafted into Vereker's army. They knew the land. They knew the plow. They knew livestock. Daniel gave them the same terms as everyone else: 5 acres, a seal, and a contract. Some didn't believe it. They stood there staring at the parchment bearing the Baron's seal, unable to comprehend that it was real. One man asked Daniel what would happen if he changed his mind. Daniel replied that the seal could not be revoked. That is the law of the kingdom. The man pressed the parchment to his chest and left, just as Gregor had once done. Vereker did not return. But he did not disappear either. Kaede's scouts reported that the Count had locked himself in his castle. His lands were becoming desolate. The peasants were fleeing, not only to Hollowmarch. Now they were fleeing everywhere, west, south, anywhere. Vereker was left with barren land and a handful of guards. Lydia said this was the beginning of the end for him, that there was a law in the kingdom regarding deserted lands. If a baron or count could not maintain a minimum population on his territory for 2 years, the crown had the right to revoke the title. Vereker was already on the brink. Daniel nodded. He said he didn't want him destroyed. He wanted him to understand. Lydia looked at him and said that some people were incapable of understanding. They could only accept defeat. Daniel didn't reply. 2 weeks after Vereker's retreat, something happened that Daniel hadn't expected. The old count arrived at the gates of Hollowmarch, alone, on foot, unarmed, without a guard, without a horse, just an old man on the road. The guards at the gate reported to Kaede. Kaede reported to Daniel. Daniel went out to the gate. Vereker stood in the dust, old, broken, but upright, his back straight, his chin raised. He was one of those men who do not bend even when all is lost. Vereker said he had come for a duel. According to ancient law, baron against count, sword against sword. If Daniel wins, Vereker will surrender his lands. If Vereker wins, Daniel will leave. Daniel looked at him. Then he said no duel. Instead, he invited the count to dinner. Vereker stood motionless for 10 seconds. Then he walked through the gate. Kaede followed him 3 paces behind, her hand on her sword. Vereker was led into the keep's hall, the very same hall where a year ago, Daniel had laid out the first 87 coins on the table in front of Gareth. Now there was a long table in the hall. Helena had set the table for dinner, a simple meal, bread made from their own flour, porridge with meat, beer, apples from the orchard Gregor had planted by the mill. Vereker sat down. Daniel sat across from him. They were alone. Kaede stood by the door, outside. Vereker ate in silence. Then he spoke. He said he was 58 years old, that he had fought in 3 campaigns, that his father had been a count and his grandfather had been a count, that he had known one rule his whole life, the strong rule. The weak obey. Fear maintains order. Without fear there would be chaos. He knew this as surely as one knows the sun rises in the east. And then came a young man who feeds rather than strikes, who pays rather than takes. And in just 1 year, this young man turned a wasteland into a city richer than a count's castle. Vereker said he didn't understand how, that it went against everything he knew, that it frightened him more than any army. Daniel listened, then he replied. He said he understood. That fear works, but only in the short term. Fear makes a person obey today, but tomorrow that person will run away, or stab you in the back, or simply stop working. Fear is an expense, every day, constant. Trust is an investment, a one-time investment, and then it pays for itself. Vereker listened. His expression didn't change. Then he asked how Daniel knew all this. He's just a kid. He's 29 years old. Where do such thoughts come from? Daniel paused. Then he said, from books. Vereker snorted and said he didn't believe it, that no book describes what Daniel does. Daniel agreed. He said it wasn't in books. In this world, books are written by the victors, and the victors always write that victory is achieved through force, because that justifies them. Vereker was silent. He ate bread. The bread was good, soft, made from flour from the Gregorian mill. Vereker finished eating and said that the bread was delicious. Daniel said thank you. Vereker stood up. He said he wouldn't give up his lands, but he wouldn't attack anymore. Daniel nodded. Vereker left. Kaede walked him to the gate. The old count walked through the streets of Hollow March, looking around. He saw workshops, he saw a school, he saw children, he saw people who, a year ago, had been his peasants, but now lived here and laughed. He didn't turn around, he didn't stop, he just kept walking, and then he was gone. Daniel sat at the table and stared at Veriker's empty plate. Helena came in and sat down next to him. She asked what they had been talking about. Daniel told her. Helena was silent for a moment. Then she said that he had fed the man who had wanted to kill him. Daniel replied that it was cheaper than killing the man who had wanted to feed him. Helena didn't understand. Daniel explained. Veriker had come alone, unarmed, broken. If Daniel had killed or humiliated him, he would have become a martyr. People seek revenge for martyrs. They don't seek revenge over dinner. Helena looked at him and said that sometimes she couldn't decide. Was he kind or calculating? Daniel replied that there was a third option, kind because he's calculating. Helena smiled, for the second time this year. The first time she smiled was when he explained the double entry to her. This was the second time. Progress. The 15th month. Hollow March was growing so fast that Daniel could barely keep track. The population was 28,000. There were 12 workshops, 3 mills, 4 smithies, a school for 200 children. The infirmary had expanded into a separate building. Sora now supervised 3 assistants and focused not only on treatment but also on prevention. She went around to the new settlers and taught them to wash their hands and boil water. Simple things, obvious things, but in this world, no one knew them. Daniel once asked Sora how she knew about the connection between dirty water and disease. Sora looked at him in surprise and said it was obvious. The sick drink dirty water. Those who drink clean water don't get sick. She had noticed this when she was 10. Daniel nodded. In his world, it had taken several centuries and millions of deaths. Sora had figured it out at 10. The reply from the capital arrived 6 weeks later. Daniel opened the package bearing the royal seal in the keep's hall. Helena stood nearby. Lydia stood by the window. The document was long, bureaucratic language, subclauses, references to decrees from 300 years ago. Lydia read it faster than anyone else. She looked up and said one word. Approved. Helena sat down on a bench. She just sat down. Her legs wouldn't hold her up. Daniel read the document himself. The Royal Chancellery recognizes the province of Hollow March as a free city with the right to self-government within the bounds of royal law, the right to its own court, the right to a chamber of commerce, the right to mint coins, provided the royal standard of weight and fineness is maintained, the Chancellor's signature, the crown seal. Daniel placed the document on the table. Then he sat down. Then he closed his eyes. A free city. A year and 7 months ago, it had been an empty plain with 3 villages and 87 elderly people. Now it was a free city, with rights, with laws, with its own currency. Lydia approached and said that she had been preparing these documents for 3 weeks, that she had included every paragraph of royal law she could find, that if there had been a single person in the Chancellery attentive enough to find fault, the petition would have been rejected. But there wasn't, because the petition was flawless. Daniel looked at her and said thank you. Lydia nodded. Then she added that she hadn't done it for his sake. She'd done it because for the first time in 9 years of working at the Treasury, she'd drafted a document that made the world a better place, not a worse one. Daniel didn't know what to say. Helena did. She said it was time for Lydia to stop saying she was only here temporarily. Lydia looked at Helena. Helena looked back at her. 2 intelligent women, 2 strong women. Standing between them was a man who failed to see the obvious. Lydia said the audit wasn't over yet. Helena replied that the audit had already been going on for 2 months, and that something told her it would last another 2 years. Lydia didn't answer, but she didn't object either. The coin was minted at the beginning of the 18th month. Minji brought a master coin engraver from the south, an old man with crooked fingers and an exceptionally keen eye. He carved the die in 3 days. On the obverse was Daniel's profile. On the reverse was an ear of wheat. Not a sword, not a lion, not an eagle. An ear of wheat. Minji said it was silly, that a coin should inspire strength. Daniel replied that an ear of wheat is strength, just a different kind. Minji argued for half an hour. Then she gave in and said he was hopeless. The first coin was struck in front of everyone. Minji stood at the press herself and struck it with the hammer. The coin came out warm and heavy, golden, with an ear of wheat on one side and Daniel's face on the other. Minji took it in her hands. She looked at it for a long time. Then she walked over to Daniel and solemnly presented it to him. She said it was the first coin of Hollow March. Daniel took it. He turned it over in his fingers. It was warm, just like those coins from the chest, only this one was different. This one was made by people, with their own hands, from metal mined from their own land. Daniel put the coin in his pocket and said he would keep it. Minji snorted and said she hoped so, because the next ones would go into circulation. By the 18th month, the population had exceeded 30,000. The city was growing not outward, but upward. 2-story stone houses, paved streets in the center, a water supply from the river that Gareth and a crew of masons had dammed to raise the water level. Daniel recalled the word aqueduct and tried to explain the principle to Gregor. Gregor listened for 3 minutes, then said he understood and that it was simpler than a mill. A month later, water was flowing through wooden troughs from the dam to the city center. Not a luxury, a necessity. 30,000 people can't keep walking to the wells. A system is needed. Daniel drew diagrams on the wall of the keep. The wall had long been covered with numbers and plans. Helena said it was time to whitewash the wall. Daniel refused. He said it was his work surface. Lydia once looked at the wall and said that if anyone in the capital saw these calculations, half the treasury would resign out of shame. Daniel asked why. Lydia replied that it was because a single exiled baron could calculate more accurately with a piece of charcoal on the wall than the entire department could on parchment. The 18th month brought an unexpected guest, a nobleman from a distant province, young, rich. He arrived with a delegation of 6 and proposed a trade agreement. He wanted to buy flour and cloth. He paid well, but during the negotiations, he asked a question that silenced the entire table. He asked Daniel how many peasants he had. Daniel replied calmly. He said that there were no peasants in Hollow March. There were citizens, 30,000 citizens. The nobleman didn't understand. He asked again. Daniel repeated himself. Citizens, people who live here by their own choice, who have land, a contract, and a seal, who pay taxes not because they're forced to, but because in return they receive schools, a hospital, and protection. The nobleman blinked. He looked at Helena, at Lydia, at Kaede, standing by the door. Then he quietly asked if he could stay for a couple of days to see how it worked. Daniel nodded. The nobleman stayed for a week. He left with a trade agreement and the look of someone who'd just been shown another planet. Daniel began building a hospital, a real one, not an infirmary in a wing of the keep, a separate building, made of stone, with a roof, with separate rooms for patients, with a storeroom for herbs, with a room for Sora. When Sora saw the plan, she started crying, quietly, with her face turned away. Iris hugged her and told her to stop sobbing and that it was time to make a list of what was needed. Sora wiped her eyes and began to write. The list took up 3 sheets of parchment. Daniel looked at it and whistled. Then he nodded and said he approved of everything. Iris approached him afterward and spoke quietly so no one would hear. She said that when she had taken Sora in on the road 15 years ago, the girl weighed as much as a doll and didn't cry. Not once during that first year did she cry. But today she cried because she'd been given a room. Iris said that if Daniel ever hurt this girl, Iris would break both his arms. Daniel solemnly promised he wouldn't hurt her. Iris nodded and went to make soup. Hollow March Academy. Daniel had been thinking about it since his 3rd month. Not a school, not a vocational course, an academy. A place where they teach more than just reading and arithmetic, but also how to think. Where a peasant's son can become an engineer, where a refugee's daughter can become a doctor, where one's background doesn't determine one's future. He discussed the idea with Lydia. Lydia said there was nothing like it in the kingdom. There are church schools for the nobility, there are monastic libraries, but there is no place where everyone is taught regardless of bloodline. Daniel said there would be one now. Lydia asked if he understood the risks involved. The Church of the Bright Circle controls education. An academy without the church's blessing is a challenge. Daniel said he was ready for the challenge. Lydia looked at him for a long time. Then she said she would help draft the charter so that formally it wouldn't violate a single church law. Daniel asked how. Lydia smiled her small, almost imperceptible smile and said that she had worked for 9 years in a system that thrives on loopholes. She knows every one of them. They worked on the academy's charter for 3 evenings in a row. They sat at the table in the keep's hall until late at night discussing every clause. Lydia knew the law. Daniel knew the goal. Together, they drafted a document that didn't exist in this world. Helena would come in and bring them tea. Once, she lingered at the door, watching them argue. Daniel was passionately arguing that women should be admitted to the academy. Lydia calmly explained that while royal law did not prohibit the education of women, there was a tradition that was stronger than the law. Daniel said that traditions change. Lydia said they do change, but more slowly than one would like. They reached a compromise. The charter made no mention of gender at all. Anyone who passed the test was accepted. Everyone meant everyone. Helena stood by the door and smiled. For the 3rd time. Daniel didn't see it. Lydia did. The 19th month. The academy opened in a former barn that had been converted into a school building. 3 classrooms, 12 students in each. The first class, Barrow became the head teacher. Daniel invited 2 more. A defrocked monk named Fergus who knew mathematics and astronomy. and a woman named Wen, one of the southern refugees, who could draw maps with a precision that made Kaede whistle in admiration. 3 teachers, 36 students, 12 of them were women. 4 were farmers' children, 3 were former farmhands. 1 was a former soldier of Veriker. Hollow March Academy, the first educational institution in the kingdom that accepted everyone. At the opening ceremony, Daniel didn't give a speech. He simply came in and sat down in the back row. He listened as Barrow taught the first lesson about letters and numbers and about how knowledge is not a privilege of blood, but a right for everyone. Barrow spoke quietly. The students listened. Daniel sat there thinking about the boy Theo, who had asked him if it was possible to learn to read. Theo was now sitting in the front row. He was 8. He read better than half the adults in town. His mother could read, and now he could too. Programs written in the abstract always fail. Programs written for a living person work for everyone. Theo was living proof. The 21st month, rumors about Hollow March had reached the royal court. Not trade rumors, not complaints from the barons, something else. Whispers in the palace corridors, conversations behind closed doors. An exiled baron built a city. An exiled baron mints coins. An exiled baron opened an academy that accepts students without a noble lineage. Daniel knew that sooner or later, the capital would turn its real attention to him. Not the kind from the lecture hall. Political attention. Lydia had warned him. She said that the court wasn't Baron Craigford or Count Veriker. The court was a machine that ground down anyone who became too conspicuous. Daniel replied that he understood. Lydia said no, he didn't understand, because he thought in terms of economics, while the court thought in terms of power. For the court, money was a tool, not an end in itself. The goal is control, and Hollow March slipped out of control the moment it gained the right to mint its own coin. The first sign came in the form of a letter, not from the king, from the chancellor. Polite, formal, the chancellor expressed admiration for Baron Hartwell's successes and invited him to the annual Council of Lords in the capital. Attendance is mandatory for all rulers of free cities. Daniel read the letter twice, then he passed it to Lydia. Lydia read it and turned pale. She said that the Council of Lords wasn't a council. It was an arena, a place where nobles settled disputes and where the crown demonstrated who was in charge. They couldn't refuse. An invitation bearing the chancellor's seal was tantamount to an order. Daniel asked when. Lydia said in 6 weeks. Daniel nodded. 6 weeks. Enough time to prepare. He called a meeting. Everyone. Helena, Kaede, Minji, Gareth, Iris, Sora, Lydia. He announced that he was going to the capital, alone. Kaede said he wasn't going alone. She's going with him. It's not up for discussion. Daniel looked at her. Kaede looked back at him. Her face was as hard as stone. Daniel nodded. Helena said she was going too, as the manager, with the documents, the figures, and the evidence proving that Hollow March is legitimate and thriving. Lydia said she would travel separately. She'll return as an auditor. It's safer that way. If anyone at court finds out she sympathizes with Daniel, it will be used against both of them. Daniel agreed. Minji said she was staying behind. Business can't wait, but if the Baron needs anything in the capital, she has 3 contacts among the merchant guilds. Daniel accepted that as well. Gareth said he would guard the city while the Baron was away. Iris said she would keep watch over Gareth. Sora remained silent. Then, after the meeting, she approached Daniel and handed him a small pouch. Inside were dried herbs. Sora said they were for headaches and insomnia. Daniel took the pouch and said thank you. Sora nodded and left. She stopped at the door. She turned around. She said quietly for him to come back. Daniel promised he would. The journey to the capital took 8 days. Daniel rode on horseback. Kaede was by his side. Behind them, Helena followed in a wagon carrying a trunk of documents. It was a small convoy. 20 militiamen in crisp uniforms that Minji had sewn especially for them. On each breastplate was the Hollow March coat of arms, an ear of wheat on a blue field. Not a lion, not a sword, an ear of wheat. Daniel looked at his men and thought that in his former world, this would have been called branding. Here, it was called honor. The essence was the same. People see the symbol and remember what stands behind it. The capital was called Veldheim, a big city. Stone walls 3 times a man's height, towers, bridges. A castle on a hill. Crowds in the streets, noise, mud, beggars at the gates. Daniel watched and counted. A habit. There were many beggars, more than he'd expected. Hungry faces, tattered clothes, children without shoes. The capital of the kingdom, and yet there were starving children in the streets. Kaede rode beside him, saying nothing. She knew this city. She'd served here. She'd fled from here. Her face was closed off, hardened. Daniel didn't ask. They were shown to the guest quarters at the palace. A small room, clean, cold. Kaede inspected every corner. She checked the windows, the doors, the walls. Then she nodded.
It's livable.
Helena laid out the documents on the table and began preparing Daniel for the council. She knew the etiquette, she knew the formalities, she knew whom to bow to and whom not to. Daniel listened and took it all in. In his former world, he'd navigated the bureaucratic procedures of City Hall. It was similar here, only instead of bureaucrats, there were lords. Instead of regulations, there were traditions. Instead of voting, there were swords. The Council of Lords had gathered in the castle's great hall, a long, horseshoe-shaped table, 32 seats, barons, counts, 2 dukes, the chancellor presiding. The royal throne was empty. The king was not present. It was a sign. The chancellor ruled on his behalf. Daniel took his seat at the far end of the table, the youngest baron, an exile, a seat at the very edge. Kaede stood behind him. Helena sat behind a partition with documents. Lydia sat at the opposite end of the hall among the treasury officials. Their eyes met for a second. Lydia nodded, almost imperceptibly. Master Alvin led Daniel into the basement of the royal archives. Long corridors, dust. Thousands of parchments rolled into tubes and stacked on floor-to-ceiling shelves, the smell of old paper and wax. Alvin walked without looking back. He knew every turn, every step. Daniel followed him. Kaede stayed upstairs by the entrance. Alvin said something about how what they were about to discuss was not for strangers' ears, not even for the most loyal ones. They stopped in a small room at the very end of the basement. A table, 2 chairs, a single candle. A parchment lay on the table. It was very old. The edges had darkened with age. The seal on it was so ancient that the wax had almost crumbled away. Alvin sat down and motioned for Daniel to take the second chair. Then he spoke, quietly, like a man who had been waiting for this conversation for many years. He said he knew about the chest. He knew about the coins that appeared at dawn. He knew about the connection between people's well-being and income. He knew everything. Daniel didn't move. Alvin continued. 300 years ago, right here in this very archive, the last founding king, Aldrich the Just, signed the first Charter of Rights for free people. A document that granted every inhabitant of the kingdom the right to a trial and to protection, regardless of bloodline. The charter lasted 3 years. Then, Aldrich was betrayed by his own lords. They didn't want free people. Free people ask questions. They make demands. They leave. A free peasant is a lost peasant. Aldrich was surrounded in his castle, in Hollow March, in the very keep where Daniel now lives. He was dying for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he made an oath. Alvin picked up the parchment from the table and read it. The words were ancient, in a language almost no one knew anymore, but the meaning was clear. Let this land pay only to those who pay it. Let the crown here be a measure not of power, but of consent. Daniel listened. His hands rested on his knees, calm. But inside, everything was buzzing. The ability, the ruler's treasury. Not a gift from the heavens, not a coincidence. The echo of the dying king's oath, an oath that had slept for 300 years within the stones of the keep, waiting for the man who would meet its conditions. Daniel asked Alvin why him, why specifically him. Alvin answered simply, because in 300 years, not a single ruler had come to Hollow March who wanted to pay the people instead of taking from them. Daniel was the first. Daniel asked how Alvin knew about the oath. Alvin replied that he was the keeper of the archives for 40 years. He had found that parchment 30 years ago. He read it, he understood, and he had been waiting ever since. Daniel asked what he had been waiting for. Alvin said he had been waiting for a man. Then Alvin revealed what changed everything. He said that Daniel's exile to Hollow March was no accident. The king's nephew had indeed taken offense at the banquet. The decree of exile had indeed been signed. But the place of exile wasn't chosen by the king. It was chosen by Alvin, the quiet archivist in the dusty basement. He slipped the right parchment to the right official. The official signed it without looking. Hollow March. The only place in the kingdom where Aldrich's oath could be awakened. Daniel looked at the old man. Then he asked how Alvin knew that he, of all people, would be the one. Alvin smiled and said he didn't know for sure. But he had been watching the young Baron Hartwell ever since the latter had told the king's nephew that a hungry peasant was more valuable to the kingdom than a well-fed one. No one at court had ever spoken such words. Alvin decided to take a chance. Daniel sat in the silence of the cellar and thought. His exile had been staged. His meeting with Hollow March had been planned. The old man in the dusty cellar had waited 30 years for a ruler for the Deadlands and decided that Daniel was the one. Daniel asked one more question. Why was Alvin telling him this now? Alvin replied that it was because there were people at court who also knew about the oath. Not the details, but the fact itself. They knew that something had awakened in Hollow March, and they wanted to control it or destroy it. The Chancellor was one of them. An invitation to the Council of Lords isn't an honor, it's a test. They're watching Daniel and deciding whether he can be used or whether it's better to eliminate him. Daniel nodded. He asked what Alvin advised. Alvin replied that he advised returning to Hollow March as quickly as possible and preparing. Because the next blow would not come from the Baron or the Count, it would come from the Crown. The return journey took 7 days. Daniel rode hard. Kaede didn't ask why. Helena knew. On the 3rd day of the journey, a rider caught up with them, a messenger from Hollow March, sent by Min-ji. The news was mixed. Good news, a trade caravan from the west had delivered an order for 1,000 sacks of flour from the Union of Free Settlements, the largest contract in the province's history. Bad news, 2 caravans had been attacked on the southern route in a single week. Not bandits, organized units. Min-ji believed they were Baron Craigford's men. He'd decided that if he couldn't compete with Hollow March, he could cut off its trade routes. Daniel listened to the messenger, then he sent him back with 2 orders. The first was for Kaede, double the caravan guards. The second was for Min-ji, open negotiations with Craigford, not threats, negotiations. Offer him a share of the trade, 5% of the turnover in exchange for the safety of the trade route, cheaper than war, more profitable than hostility. They returned to Hollow March at sunset on the 7th day. Daniel saw the city from the road and reined in his horse. He looked on, the stone walls of the inner ring, the rooftops of the houses, stretching toward the horizon, smoke rising from the workshops, lights in the windows. 34,000 windows, 34,000 lives. Kaede stopped beside him. She was silent. Helena peered out from the wagon. Daniel urged his horse on and rode toward the gates. They were waiting for him at the gates. Gareth, Iris, Sora, Min-ji, Lydia, who had returned from the capital 2 days early. They stood in a line. Gareth grumbled that the Baron was leaving for too long. Iris said he'd lost weight and that she'd go make some soup right away. Sora stood a little behind them and watched. When Daniel dismounted, she approached and asked if the herbs had helped her. Daniel said they had. Her head hadn't hurt even once. Sora smiled, a small smile, the first one he could remember. Min-ji approached with a businesslike stride and said that Craigford had agreed to 4% and that she'd bargained him down to 3.5%. Daniel looked at her. Min-ji shrugged and said that 7% was too generous for a man who'd robbed her caravans. Daniel nodded. Lydia was the last to approach. She said that a decree was being prepared in the capital. She didn't know the details, but she knew it concerned the free cities and that it was being drafted quickly. Daniel nodded. He said he knew, that he was ready. Daniel spent the next 4 weeks preparing, not for war, for politics. Lydia drafted legal documents. Every Hollow March decree was checked for compliance with royal law. Every contract, every trade license. If the Crown decided to strike legally, there must be no loopholes. Helena prepared financial reports, transparent, detailed. Every coin accounted for. Min-ji was strengthening trade ties, new contracts with Western settlements, new suppliers from the south. Daniel wanted Hollow March to be so deeply woven into the kingdom's trade network that pulling it out would mean bringing down 6 markets. Kaede expanded the militia to 400 men. Daniel had no objection. The militia was defensive. The people were protecting their home, their families. Kaede trained them not only in combat but also in discipline. Not a single Hollow March militiaman had ever raised a hand against a civilian. That was rule number 1. Anyone who broke it was expelled, forever. In 2 years, not a single one had broken it. The 23rd month, a decree arrived from the capital. A royal messenger in full regalia. A parchment bearing 3 seals, the Crown, the Chancellor, and the Council of Lords. Daniel broke the seals in front of everyone in the keep's hall. Helena, Lydia, Kaede, Min-ji, Gareth, Iris, Sora. The decree was long. Lydia read it aloud. The gist of it boiled down to 3 points. First, all free cities are required to pay an emergency war tax amounting to 1/3 of their annual income for the needs of the war in the East. Second, all free cities are required to provide recruits for the royal army at the rate of 1 man for every 20 residents. Third, a royal auditor is appointed to permanently oversee the finances of the free cities, with the authority to overturn any local decisions. Silence. A long silence. Kaede spoke first. She said that the conscripts numbered 1,700 men. Forced conscription. This has nothing to do with a volunteer militia. This is an army, the royal army. Their men will be taken away and sent east to die in a war that has been dragging on for 40 years. Min-ji spoke second. She said that 1/3 of the annual revenue from trade would mean ruin. Trade routes would close. Contracts would be canceled. 2 years' worth of work. Lydia spoke third. She said that an auditor with the power to overturn decisions meant the end of self-government. It was a fact. A free city that couldn't make its own decisions wasn't a free city, it was a colony. Daniel listened, then he spoke. He said that the decree was designed for one thing, either his submission or his rebellion. If he submits, Holomarch will die a slow death. If he rebels, it will die a quick one. The crown has created a situation in which both responses lead to defeat, but there is a third response. Lydia asked what it was. Daniel said he would respond to the decree with a decree of his own, that he would call for dialogue, not with a sword, not with rebellion, but with words, the very thing that holds power in this world, a signature and a seal. He asked Lydia and Helena to draft a reply. 3 days of work, 3 nights of debate. The document turned out to be long and precise. Every point of the royal decree was addressed and met with a counterproposal. The military tax. Holomarch is willing to pay, but not a third of its income. Rather, a fixed sum calculated based on population. Fair, the same for everyone. Recruits. Holomarch is prepared to provide volunteers. Only volunteers. With full pay from the city treasury, not conscription. A contract. Auditor. Holomarch invites an auditor, but with the right to oversee, not to overrule, an observer, not a ruler. And most importantly, the message ended with a proposal. Holomarch is ready to receive any representative of the crown for negotiations, openly, transparently, on terms acceptable to both sides. The reply from the capital arrived 3 weeks later. Not a letter, an army, 2,000 men, the royal standard, professional soldiers. Not peasants with spears like Veracers, trained infantry, cavalry, archers. They set up camp half a day's journey from Holomarch. Kaide's scouts reported at dawn. Daniel stood on the wall and looked east, dust on the horizon. The sun was setting behind him, bathing the city walls in gold. Kaide reported, 400 militiamen against 2,000 soldiers. The walls were stone, but not very high. A 1-hour supply of arrows, enough provisions for a month-long siege. No chance of victory in open battle. They'd hold out under siege for 3 weeks, maybe 4. Daniel listened. He nodded. Then he said there would be no battle. Kaide looked at him. She already knew that expression. Calm, focused, the expression of a man who is thinking. Daniel called a council, the last council before what was about to happen. Everyone, Helena, Lydia, Kaide, Minji, Gareth, Iris, Sora, 7 people he trusted more than anyone else in his 2 lifetimes. He told them the plan. Helena listened and turned pale. Lydia listened and nodded. Kaide listened and gripped the hilt of her sword. Minji listened and counted on her fingers. Gareth listened and remained silent. Iris listened and shook her head. Sora listened and kept her eyes fixed on Daniel. The plan was simple. Daniel would go out to face the army, not alone, with all the residents of Holomarch. 34,000 people, unarmed, all of them. Women, children, the elderly, artisans, farmers, teachers, healers. All 34,000 would march outside the walls and stand before the royal army. Not as a shield, not as hostages, as citizens, as people who have the right to stand on their own land. Minji asked what would happen if they started shooting. Daniel said that they won't. 2,000 soldiers won't fire on 34,000 unarmed people, because every one of those soldiers knows that behind these walls live people just like them. Peasants, artisans, children. If the commander orders them to fire, the soldiers will look at the crowd and see their mothers, their children, themselves. Kaede said it was madness. Daniel said it was math. 34,000 against 2,000. Not in battle, in humanity. He's betting that humanity is stronger than orders. Helena said that if he's wrong, everyone will die. Daniel said he knows. Lydia said that, from a legal standpoint, an unarmed civilian population marching out to meet the army isn't an insurrection. It's a peaceful expression of will. The Crown cannot declare unarmed women and children to be rebels. It cannot do so and still save face. Daniel nodded. Exactly. The Crown can crush a rebellion, but it cannot crush a city that stands its ground and does not fight back, because word will get out to the merchants, the neighboring barons, the entire continent. A crown that kills the unarmed is a crown that forfeits its right to the throne. Lydia added that she would write about this to the capital, immediately, through her own channels. A messenger would leave tonight. By morning, half the chancellery would know what was happening. Daniel nodded. Gareth spoke for the first time during the entire council meeting. He spoke briefly. He had lived through 72 years under 3 kings. None of them had been worth going beyond the walls for. This one is. He'll be the first to go. Iris slammed her palm down on the table and said that if that old fool was going, then she was going too. Minji said that she had 20,000 gold pieces worth of goods in her warehouses, and that if everything was lost, she'd deduct it from his salary. Daniel replied that he didn't have a salary. Minji said that in that case, she'd take it from his dinner. Sora approached Daniel after the meeting. She handed him a bundle of dried herbs, the same ones from outside the capital. She told him not to forget to breathe. Daniel took the herbs and said thank you. Morning, dawn. Daniel went down to the basement. He opened the chest. 190,000 coins. A record. He looked at the gold, then he closed the chest. He went upstairs. He stepped out onto the square. They were standing there, all of them. 34,000 people. The square couldn't hold them all. People were standing in the streets, on the rooftops, by the walls. Daniel climbed the steps to the keep. He looked down at them. Faces. Thousands of faces. He knew hundreds of names. Gareth, Iris, Sora, Helena, Kaede, Minji, Lydia, Gregor, Barrow, Theo, little Theo in the front row, 8 years old. He'd come to Hollow March with his mother and asked if he could learn to read. Now he was standing in the front row, holding his mother's hand. Daniel looked at him and thought that everything he'd done over the past 2 years had started with one boy who wanted to read. Programs written for a real person work for everyone. Daniel spoke. Briefly, he said there was an army outside the gates, that he wouldn't fight, that he would go out to meet them, and that he was asking everyone who wanted to come with him to do so. He wasn't forcing anyone. He was asking. Those who didn't want to could stay behind the walls, without judgment, without consequences. He fell silent. He waited. Theo let go of his mother's hand and took a step forward, an 8-year-old boy, the first. Behind him, Gareth, old, with sore legs, straight as a pole. Behind him, Iris. Behind her, Sora. Behind her, Gregor. Behind him, Barrow. The people began to move, not all at once, in waves, one after another. Families, groups. The gates opened. 34,000 people emerged onto the plain before the walls of Hollow March and came to a halt, unarmed, silent, alive. The royal army stood 500 paces away. Daniel walked in front. Kaede walked on the right, without a sword. She had left it at the gate. For the first time in her life, she was walking without weapon. Helena walked on the left, with a parchment in her hands, a message for the army commander, legally flawless. Lydia had written it that night. The standoff lasted 9 days. For 9 days, the army remained encamped half a day's journey away. For 9 days, the residents of Hollow March went about their usual lives. The mills were grinding. Smoke rose from the workshops. The school was open. Sora was treating patients. Iris was grumbling. Barrow was teaching. The children were running about. 34,000 people weren't hiding. They weren't panicking. They were living their lives. Daniel had ordered that trade continue as usual. Minji's caravans passed by the royal camp twice during those days. The soldiers watched the wagons loaded with flour and cloth. They watched the guards, who did not raise their weapons. They watched the drivers, who nodded to them as if they were neighbors. Minji sent 3 wagons of bread and beer to the camp, for free. The soldiers ate bread made from Hollow March flour and remained silent. On the 4th day, the general requested a meeting. Daniel received him in the keep's hall, one-on-one. Kaede stood behind the door. The general sat down and was silent for a long time. Then he said he had sent a messenger to the capital. He reported on the situation. He wrote that there was no rebellion, that there was no resistance, that before him lay a city that was not at war, but going about its daily life, that to attack it would mean destroying 34,000 peaceful people, in full view of the merchants, who had already spread the news throughout the 4 provinces. The general said he was awaiting a reply from the capital. Daniel nodded. He offered the general some tea. The general refused. Then he changed his mind and accepted. They drank tea in silence. Before leaving, the general said one thing. He said that in 15 years of service, he had never once seen a city open its gates to welcome an army. Daniel replied that gates are open to those whom they do not fear. The general looked at him. Then he nodded and left. On the 7th day, a messenger arrived from the capital. The general read the message. Then he came to Daniel again. He said that the chancellor had been recalled, that changes had taken place at court, that Master Elvin had somehow secured an audience with the king and shown him documents that no one had seen in 300 years. The Aldrich Charter, the Founder's Oath, and the history of Hollow March. The general did not know the details. He knew only the outcome. The army had been ordered to return to the capital. Hollow March's status as a free city had been confirmed. The emergency decree had been revoked. A new one had been issued in its place. The crown recognized Hollow March as a special territory with expanded rights of self-government, the first of its kind in the kingdom. Daniel listened. Then he asked about the military tax. The general said the tax had been replaced by a voluntary contribution. The amount is determined by the city. Daniel asked about the recruits. The general said that conscription had been abolished. In its place was contract service, volunteers on the city's terms. Daniel asked about the auditor. The general said there would be an auditor, but with the right to oversee, not to abolish. An observer, not a ruler, exactly as Daniel had proposed in his first message. Daniel nodded. Then he extended his hand to the general. The general shook it, firmly, as an equal. Then he stood up and left. At dawn on the 9th day, the army broke camp and marched eastward. Dust settled on the road. Silence. Daniel stood on the wall and watched as the last ranks of soldiers disappeared over the horizon. Kaede stood beside him. She was silent. Helena stood on the other side. She was silent too. Lydia stood slightly behind them. Minjae leaned against a crenellation and was counting something on her fingers. Gareth sat on the steps because his legs hurt, but he had come anyway. Iris stood behind him and pretended she'd just stepped out for some fresh air. Sora stood by the infirmary door with a flower in her hands, a small blue flower from her garden. That evening, Daniel organized a dinner. Not a feast, just dinner. Long tables in the square. Everyone together. Merchants and peasants, militiamen and teachers, artisans and children. 34,000 people. Bread made from their own flour. Porridge with meat, beer, apples. Minji brought spices from the south. The tables smelled so good that passers-by on distant streets slowed their pace. Daniel sat at the head of the table, Helena to his right, Kaede to his left, Lydia across from him, Minji next to Lydia, Gareth at the end of the table. Iris walked between the rows, making sure everyone was eating. Sora was feeding the 3 children she had nursed back to health from a fever 6 months ago. Barrow sat with the academy students. Gregor was sitting at his mill and eating there because the mill couldn't be left unattended. Theo was sitting in the front row with his mother, reading aloud to her from the book Daniel had given him for his birthday, the first book the boy had ever owned. His mother listened and wept. Minji stood up. She took a coin out of her pocket, the first Hollow March coin, with an ear of wheat on one side and Daniel's profile on the other. She approached him solemnly. She said that this coin belonged to him. She had kept it since the day she minted it. Now she was returning it. Daniel took the coin. Warm, heavy, golden, an ear of wheat, not a sword, not a lion, an ear of wheat. He put it in his pocket. He said thank you. Minji snorted and said he owed her 6%. Daniel said 3.5. Minji laughed and sat back down. Helena turned to him. She called him by his name. Just Daniel, no title. They'd done it. Daniel looked at her. He nodded. They had. Kaede was silent, but her silence was different, warm. She sat next to him and didn't keep her hand on her sword. For the first time in 2 years, she just sat there, like a human being, not like a guard. Lydia raised her mug of beer and said quietly that the audit was officially over. She was staying, not as an auditor, as a citizen of Hollow March. Daniel looked at her. Lydia looked back at him, gray eyes, a small smile. Helena saw that smile, and she didn't look away. Sora walked over and placed a blue flower from her garden on the table in front of Daniel, the first flower. She didn't say a word, she just placed it there and left. Iris was crying at the far table. She pretended something had gotten in her eye. Gareth looked at her and handed her a handkerchief. Iris took it and blew her nose so loudly that 3 children at the next table laughed. Night. Dinner was over. People were get. The lights in the windows went out one by one. The city fell asleep. 34,000 people, 34,000 hearths, 34,000 lives that hadn't existed on this earth 2 years ago. Daniel climbed to the highest tower of the keep, alone. Kaede stayed below. For the first time, she didn't follow him, not because she had stopped protecting him, but because she realized he needed to be alone. Daniel stood on the tower and looked out over the city. Below him were dark rooftops, sparse lights in the windows, smoke rising from Gregor's mill, which operated even at night, the distant barking of a dog, a child's cry that immediately fell silent as its mother picked it up. Silence, a living silence. The silence of a city that breathes and sleeps and dreams. Daniel took a coin out of his pocket, the first Hollow March coin, an ear of wheat. He turned it over in his fingers. It was warm, like those coins from the chest at dawn. He looked at it, then at the city, then back at the coin, and he said quietly, in a language no one here knew, in English, that the mayor could consider the report on the food stamp program submitted, and that he was requesting permission to proceed to the next quarter. The wind blew from the west, warm, summery. It carried the scent of wheat from the fields, smoke from the hearths, and the scent of herbs from Sora's garden. Daniel stood on the tower and listened to the city breathe. 34,000 living, well-fed, free people, each of whom is worth more than the sum of their expenses. Each one is not an expense, but an investment. Each one has voluntarily chosen this land, this baron, and this future. Down in the dungeon's basement, an old chest awaited dawn. In a few hours, the first ray of sunlight would pierce through a crack in the wall, and the chest would fill with gold. 100,000 coins, maybe more. Every coin represents a person. Every person is a story. Every story is proof that it is possible to govern differently. Not through fear, not through blood, not through the law of the strong, but through a simple accounting truth that an economist from Chicago had learned at his desk and proven on a scorched plain in a world where it was never meant to exist. Daniel slipped a coin into his pocket. He stood there for another minute. Then he turned around and headed downstairs. Tomorrow would bring a lot of work. New houses, new workshops, new students at the academy, new caravans, new people who would arrive and whom he would need to welcome, feed, and ask, "What's your name?" Tomorrow would be a new day, the first day of the next quarter. Daniel walked down the steps, smiling. At the foot of the stairs stood Iris with a bowl of hot soup. She said he'd forgotten to eat again. Daniel took the bowl. The soup was hot. He sat down on a step and ate. Iris stood nearby and watched. Then she said quietly, "You're a good boy," and she left. Daniel finished his soup. He set the bowl down. He closed his eyes. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the city walls lay a plain that had been empty 2 years ago. But now people lived there, alive, well-fed, free, and that was how it should be.